Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. Tonight's story is a long one, considerably longer than most we tell in this room, so let yourself settle in properly, get truly comfortable before we begin. On the 15th of July, in the year 1199 by our own reckoning, a Thursday morning in the middle of a Mediterranean summer, a small breach finally opened in the northern wall of the city of Jerusalem, torn open by a wooden siege tower that a starving, sunburned, disease-ravaged army had spent weeks dragging. Plank by plank across ground its own engineers had to clear under a rain of Greek fire and stones, and through that single breach, after 3 years of marching and starving and dying across most of the length of the known world, the soldiers of what history would come to call the First Crusade finally poured into the holiest city in Christendom, and what followed over the next 2 days was a slaughter so total and so indiscriminate that the men who wrote about it afterward, in their own letters, home and their own celebratory chronicles, did not think to hide it or soften it at all, because to them it was not a crime to be concealed. It was a triumph to be recorded in loving and specific detail as proof that God himself had walked beside them the entire way, a proof they wanted their own children and their own grandchildren, and every future generation of pilgrims who would ever afterward make this same long and dangerous journey, to read and to believe exactly as fervently as they themselves believed it in that single, blood-soaked, sun-bright morning. We are not going to rush to that breach in the wall tonight, tempting as it is to leap straight to the single most famous and most terrible image this whole story ever produced, because the massacre at Jerusalem, horrifying as it was, only makes sense, only tells us anything true about how an ordinary Thursday morning could end that way, once we understand everything that built toward it across the 4 years before it happened. A Byzantine emperor pleading for a few thousand mercenaries and receiving instead an entire migrating civilization. A pope standing in a field in central France and reshaping with a single sermon what an armed man's violence could mean for the fate of his own soul. Tens of thousands of ordinary peasants who never asked to be part of any of it, walking into disaster after disaster on the strength of nothing more than a preacher's promise and their own desperate hope. And a slow, grinding 3-year march across nearly 2,000 miles of hostile territory that killed, by the most careful modern estimates, considerably more of the people who set out on it than ever lived to see the city they had marched to capture. We are going to take our time tonight, the way we always try to in this room, letting each stage of this long and difficult journey breathe before we move on to the next one, because a story this heavily built on faith, ambition, and grief deserves the patience of a slow telling, rather than a hurried summary of dates and battles. Let us say the thesis plainly, here at the very beginning, the way we like to on this channel, so you know the shape of the long night ahead of you. This is a story about how an idea, once it is given the right combination of religious authority, political convenience, and sheer accumulated social pressure, can move hundreds of thousands of ordinary people to abandon their homes, their families, and in a great many cases their own lives, in pursuit of a promise that only a small handful of them would ever actually see fulfilled. It is a story about faith used, quite deliberately, as a solvent for violence that a whole society had spent generations failing to control by any other means, and about what happens when that solvent works far more completely and far more catastrophically than anyone who first proposed it could possibly have imagined. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night, and there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, settle in for a long and unhurried night, and let yourself ease into the story of the First Crusade, the armed pilgrimage that reshaped 3 continents and rewrote the relationship between 2 great faiths for the better part of 1,000 years, and that began, like so many catastrophes this channel has told you about before, with one desperate letter asking for a small and modest kind of help that was never, by anyone's original intention, meant to be answered quite this way. A battle nobody in the West had heard of, and an empire that never recovered. To understand why tens of thousands of European men, women and children eventually found themselves marching toward Jerusalem, we have to go back some 24 years before Pope Urban II ever climbed onto a platform in a French field, to a battlefield in eastern Anatolia that almost no one in Western Europe had ever heard of at the time, and that very few remember today, near a fortress town called Manzikert, where in the year 1071 the armies of the Byzantine Empire, the direct and unbroken continuation of the old Roman Empire's eastern half, suffered a defeat so catastrophic and so poorly understood, even by the men who lived through it, that historians are still, nearly 1,000 years later, arguing over exactly how it happened, and exactly how much damage it actually did in that single afternoon. Before we go any further, it is worth pausing on the empire itself, because it is easy, once a story is remembered chiefly for what came after it, to forget how genuinely formidable the institution making this original request actually still was. The Byzantine Empire in the 11th century was not the fragile, tottering relic that later dismissive Western writers sometimes imagined it to be. It was, for most of the preceding several centuries, the single wealthiest, most sophisticated and most militarily formidable state in the entire Christian world, ruling from the magnificent walled city of Constantinople, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people at a time, when the largest cities of Western Europe struggled to reach 1/10 of that number. A city whose walls had turned back siege after siege for 700 years, whose emperors still called themselves Romans without any sense of irony at all, and whose court ceremonial, whose gold coinage, and whose professional civil administration had no equal anywhere on the continent. But that same empire, by the middle of the 11th century, had entered a period of real internal strain, a revolving door of short-lived emperors, a increasingly hollowed-out professional army that had once been the terror of its neighbours but had been allowed, through decades of court intrigue and short-sighted budget cutting, to decay into something considerably less formidable, and a new and rapidly expanding threat pressing in from the east that the empire's own leadership had badly underestimated. That threat came from the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic Central Asian people who had converted to Islam generations before and had, within the span of only a few decades, built an empire of their own that stretched from Central Asia through Persia and into the heart of the Muslim Middle East, and Seljuk raiding parties had, by the early 1070s, been probing deep into Byzantine Anatolia, the very heartland that had supplied the empire with the bulk of its own soldiers and its own tax revenue for centuries. The Byzantine emperor at the time, a soldier named Romanos IV Diogenes, gathered what by the standards of that particular decade was still a substantial imperial army, a patchwork force that included Byzantine regulars, foreign mercenaries from as far away as Scandinavia and Western Europe, and allied contingents of dubious loyalty, and marched east to confront the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan directly, hoping to settle the growing border crisis with a single decisive victory. What happened instead near Manzikert was a defeat made considerably worse by betrayal from within the emperor's own ranks, because a key reserve force under a rival Byzantine general, a man with his own ambitions on the imperial throne, withdrew from the field at the critical moment of the battle rather than reinforcing the emperor's own hard-pressed centre, whether through simple treachery or through a confused retreat that spiralled out of anyone's control, and the Byzantine army, its centre suddenly exposed and unsupported, collapsed into a rout, and Emperor Romanos himself was captured alive by the Seljuk forces, an almost unthinkable humiliation for a Roman emperor whose predecessors had, for 1,000 years, generally preferred death or exile to capture by a foreign power. Alp Arslan, in a gesture of chivalry that later became something of a legend in its own right, treated his captured imperial prisoner with real courtesy, releasing him under a negotiated peace rather than executing him. But the damage to Byzantine political stability had already been done regardless of the Sultan's own generosity, because Romanos returned home to find that his rivals had already moved to depose him in his absence, plunging the empire into a fresh round of civil war at the exact moment it could least afford one. And it was in the chaos and infighting that followed, far more than in the single battle itself, that Byzantine Anatolia was genuinely lost, not seized in one deliberate Seljuk conquest, but simply left ungoverned and undefended long enough for Turkish warbands, local Byzantine warlords, and opportunistic mercenaries all to carve out their own competing pieces of what had, only a decade before, been the secure and prosperous heartland of the entire empire. It is worth pausing on how much territory this single collapse actually cost, because later Crusader history only makes sense once you understand the true scale of it. Within 20 years of Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire had lost the overwhelming majority of Anatolia, the peninsula that makes up the greater part of modern Turkey, a loss that meant more than wounded pride, since Anatolia had supplied a huge proportion of the empire's own soldiers, its own grain, and its own tax revenue for centuries, so that an empire that had once stretched from southern Italy to the borders of Armenia now found Turkish warbands in some years close enough to Constantinople itself that the emperor could see their campfires from his own palace walls across the narrow strait of the Bosphorus. It was into this genuine crisis, a full generation of internal chaos following one catastrophic afternoon of battle, that a new emperor eventually emerged who would prove capable enough and desperate enough to reach out for help in a direction no Byzantine ruler had seriously considered in living memory, and whose request, once it finally arrived in the West, would set in motion a chain of events far larger and far stranger than anything he himself had actually asked for, a soldier emperor's careful letter and a pope who saw an opportunity. That emperor was Alexios I Komnenos, who seized the Byzantine throne in 1081 amid the same ongoing chaos that Manzikert had unleashed, and who proved, across a long and genuinely capable reign, to be exactly the kind of shrewd, patient, endlessly resourceful ruler the empire desperately needed to arrest its own decline, stabilizing the currency, reorganizing what remained of the army, and playing a weak diplomatic hand with real skill against a whole, rotating cast of enemies pressing in from every direction at once. Normans in the west, Pechenegs in the north, and Seljuk Turks continuing to press their advantage in the east. By the early 1090s, Alexios had stabilized his empire's core, but Anatolia remained largely lost, and he understood, with a clarity that few of his own predecessors had managed, that reclaiming even a portion of it was going to require manpower. His own depleted treasury and depleted population simply could not provide on their own. It was this specific, practical need that led Alexios, in the year 1095, to send envoys west to the court of Pope Urban II, who was at that moment holding a church council in the Italian city of Piacenza, asking, in terms that later Western sources describe with varying degrees of accuracy, for military assistance against the Turks, and it is worth pausing on exactly what Alexios was actually requesting, because the gulf between his own modest, practical request and what he eventually received is one of the more remarkable mismatches in the whole of medieval history. Alexios wanted mercenaries, professional soldiers of the kind Byzantine emperors had been hiring from Western Europe for generations already, men who would fight under Byzantine command, take Byzantine pay, and help stabilize a specific bounded military problem on the empire's own eastern frontier. What he was about to receive instead, entirely beyond anything he had asked for or could have reasonably anticipated, was the mass migration of an entire armed civilization. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children marching not as hired soldiers under his own command, but as independent, semi-autonomous armies pursuing a goal, the recapture of Jerusalem itself, that had never actually been part of his own original request at all. Urban II, the Pope who received this request and who would transform it within a matter of months into something far larger and far stranger than Alexios himself had asked for, was a Frenchman by birth, trained as a monk at the great reforming Abbey of Cluny before rising through the church hierarchy to the papal throne itself, and he inherited, on becoming Pope in 1088, a papacy that had spent the preceding several decades locked in a bitter and unresolved power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over a dispute historians call the investiture controversy, a fight over who actually held the authority to appoint bishops and abbots, the Pope or secular rulers, a controversy so bitter that Urban himself, for a portion of his own early reign, could not even safely enter the city of Rome, which remained under the control of a rival, imperially backed anti-pope. It is worth pausing on that detail because it means that the Pope who would eventually launch the single largest and most consequential mobilization of Western European manpower in centuries was, at the very moment he began planning it, a man whose own authority over the city that was supposed to be the seat of his own church was genuinely contested and genuinely fragile. Urban was also, and this matters enormously for understanding what he chose to do with Alexios's request, deeply concerned with a specific and very practical problem plaguing the whole of Western Europe in his own day, a problem the Church had already spent the better part of a century trying, with only partial success, to address through a series of movements historians call the Peace of God and the Truce of God, efforts to limit, through religious sanction and the threat of excommunication, the near-constant low-level violence that Western Europe's own warrior aristocracy, a whole class of armed knights with essentially no other socially sanctioned outlet for their own martial energy, and no organised state strong enough to fully suppress their private feuding, inflicted on peasants, churches, and each other in a more or less permanent condition of local warfare that the Church's own councils described, in increasingly alarmed language across the 11th century, as a genuine and worsening social crisis. It is worth pausing on exactly how the Church had already tried, and only partially succeeded in addressing this same crisis in the decades before Clermont, because Urban's own eventual solution grew directly out of the failure of these earlier efforts. Beginning around the year 989 at a series of church councils held across southern and central France, bishops and abbots, often acting with remarkably little support from any effective royal authority in a France whose own kings controlled, in practical terms, only a small fraction of the territory that nominally owed them allegiance, began proclaiming what historians now call the Peace of God, a body of church-sanctioned rules declaring certain categories of people, unarmed clergy, peasants, merchants, and pilgrims, formally off-limits to the violence of the warrior aristocracy, on pain of excommunication for any knight who violated the protection, a related and complementary movement, the Truce of God, which spread from similar French origins beginning around 1027, went a step further, attempting to restrict the days and seasons on which knights were permitted to fight at all, gradually expanding council by council across the following decades, from an initial ban on fighting during Sunday to a prohibition covering much of the Church's own liturgical calendar, until in principle, by the middle of the 11th century, a fully compliant knight might have found himself with only a small handful of days each year on which private warfare remained technically permitted. These movements achieved real, if distinctly partial, success, giving the Church a genuinely powerful new tool, the threat of excommunication, and the promise of eternal damnation, to deploy against a warrior class that no purely secular authority in much of France could otherwise restrain. But they never came close to actually eliminating the underlying problem, a surplus of trained, ambitious, and chronically underemployed violence that these same councils could suppress or redirect only temporarily and only incompletely. Urban's own genius at Clermont, whatever else we make of the campaign it produced, lay in recognising that this same warrior class's own energy, which decades of peace of God councils had tried and largely failed to simply restrain, might instead be redirected wholesale toward an external target, transforming a problem the Church had spent a full century trying to suppress into a project the Church could instead actively channel and bless. It is worth adding, too, a word about the wider political crisis Urban himself was personally navigating at the very moment he made this decision, because it sharpens our sense of exactly how much he personally had riding on the Crusade's success. The investiture controversy that had consumed the papacy for the preceding several decades had reached one of its own most dramatic flashpoints only 18 years before Clermont, in the winter of 1077, when the German king and future Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, excommunicated by Urban's own predecessor Pope Gregory VII, over precisely this dispute regarding who held the right to appoint bishops, was famously said to have stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates of the castle at Canossa, in northern Italy for 3 days, begging the Pope's forgiveness, an image of papal authority triumphant over secular power that briefly seemed to settle the argument decisively in the Church's own favour. The reality proved considerably messier and considerably less conclusive, Henry resuming his own struggle against the papacy within a few short years and eventually installing a rival anti-pope in Rome itself, the same anti-pope whose continued presence in the city meant that Urban, elected in 1088, spent a considerable portion of his own early papacy unable to safely reside in the very city his own office was supposed to govern from. A pope facing this kind of ongoing, unresolved challenge to his own authority had every reason to want a dramatic, unifying religious project capable of demonstrating, in the most vivid way imaginable, that the papacy, and not any rival secular ruler, stood at the head of a Christendom capable of acting, in concert, on a scale no king or emperor could match, and the Crusade, whatever its own genuinely sincere religious motivations, served that political purpose for Urban's own troubled papacy exceptionally well. Europe, in other words, in Urban's own time, had an enormous surplus of trained, armed, aggressive young men, many of them younger sons with no land of their own to inherit under the systems of primogeniture, then spreading across the continent, with essentially nothing constructive to do with their own considerable capacity for violence. It is worth pausing on that specific inheritance system for a moment, because it had reshaped the social landscape of Western Europe's own warrior aristocracy considerably in the decades leading up to Clermont, as noble families, increasingly anxious to prevent their own land holdings from being divided and subdivided into ever smaller, ever less viable parcels across successive generations, moved steadily toward a practice of leaving the entirety of a family's own land and title to a single eldest son, leaving younger brothers with a fine education in warfare, a genuine expectation of aristocratic status, and essentially no independent means of actually supporting that status once their own father died and the family estate passed intact to an elder sibling. Such men filled the ranks of Western Europe's own itinerant landless knighthood in considerable numbers by the end of the 11th century, fighting as retainers in other men's households, hiring themselves out as mercenaries, or in a great many documented cases simply turning to banditry and extortion against their own local peasantry and clergy. Precisely the kind of endemic low-level violence the Peace of God councils had been struggling to contain for the better part of a century, and it is against this specific social backdrop that Urban's promise of land, glory and salvation, combined in a single overseas venture, found such an unusually receptive audience among the very class of men Clermont's own crowd was largely composed of. And Urban, weighing Alexios's request alongside this entirely separate and homegrown European problem, appears to have arrived, sometime in the months that followed, at an idea of genuinely enormous consequence. That these two problems, a distant emperor's own carefully worded request for military help, and an entirely separate homegrown domestic surplus of restless, violent young noblemen with nowhere else to spend their own energy might be solved together in a single stroke by redirecting Western Europe's own chronic internal violence outward toward a target that carried, in the Church's own theology, a spiritual weight that no ordinary feud or border skirmish ever could. A sermon in an open field and a crowd that would not stop shouting. Urban spent the better part of a year travelling through France, an unusually long and deliberately public tour for a pope of that era, building support among the French nobility and clergy for whatever it was he had begun to plan, and it all came to a head in November of 1095 at a church council held in the town of Clermont in central France, a gathering originally called to address a whole range of ordinary ecclesiastical business, disputes over church property, questions of clerical discipline, the ongoing excommunication of the French King Philip I over his own scandalous second marriage. And it was on the final day of that council, on the 27th of November, that Urban, finding the cathedral itself too small to hold the crowd that had gathered to hear him, an assembly that had already, over the preceding week and a half of ordinary church business, drawn together some 300 bishops and abbots, along with a great many lesser clergy and secular nobles, from across France and beyond, moved the whole assembly out into an open field beyond the town walls and delivered a sermon that no complete verbatim transcript of actually survives, but that several chroniclers, writing years afterward with the full and dramatic benefit of hindsight, recorded in versions detailed enough and similar enough to each other in their broad substance, that historians have generally been willing to trust their basic outline, even while acknowledging that no two accounts agree on the Pope's exact words. It is worth naming the four principal chroniclers whose competing versions of this speech we actually possess, because their very disagreement tells its own story. Robert the Monk, Baldric of Durden, and Guibert of Nogent each wrote their own separate accounts of the Clermont sermon a decade or more after the fact, none of them present at Clermont themselves, each drawing on second-hand report and each shaping the Pope's own words, consciously or not, to fit the triumphant narrative of a crusade whose ending they already knew by the time they set pen to paper, while Fulcher of Chartres, who may genuinely have been present in the crowd that day, gives us a version that reads, by comparison, as somewhat more restrained and less rhetorically polished than the others, a reminder that even the single most consequential sermon of the entire medieval period survives for us only as a set of competing later reconstructions, each one telling us at least as much about what its own author needed Urban to have said as about what the Pope actually said out loud in that field. It is worth pausing too on the dead of the Rhineland massacres and of Peter the Hermit's own annihilated army at Civito, because this whole story, so attentive elsewhere to named individual nobles and their own carefully documented fates, can offer almost nothing of the kind for the tens of thousands who died in these two catastrophes, since the Hebrew chronicles that recorded the Rhineland massacres, precious as they are, preserve for us only a comparative handful of named victims out of what were very likely several thousand dead across the whole span of communities affected, and the peasant dead of Civitote Fair worse still, remembered by the Latin chroniclers only as an undifferentiated mass, nameless in every surviving account, their own individual hopes and individual reasons for ever setting out on this journey, in the first place buried as completely and as anonymously as their own bodies were left on that Anatolian hillside. What Urban said, in the reconstruction those chroniclers give us, wove together several distinct threads into a single electrifying appeal. He described, in language calculated to provoke real outrage among his own listeners, the sufferings of Christians living under Muslim rule in the East, some of it exaggerated for effect and some of it grounded in genuine, if often older and more localized grievances, describing churches defiled and Christian pilgrims harassed on their own journeys to the holy sites of their own faith. It is worth pausing on exactly why Jerusalem itself carried the specific, almost gravitational religious weight that made this particular appeal so effective. Because pilgrimage to the Holy City was not some novel obsession Urban himself invented for the occasion, but a tradition already many centuries old by the time he stood up to speak at Clermont. Western Christian pilgrims having travelled to Jerusalem in a more or less continuous stream since at least the 4th century, when the Roman Emperor Constantine's own mother, Helena, was credited with identifying the sites of Christ's crucifixion and burial and commissioning the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over them, a building that stood in the medieval Christian imagination as quite literally the centre of the entire physical world, a belief reflected in the era's own maps, which routinely placed Jerusalem at the exact geographic middle of a circular world divided among the 3 known continents. That tradition of pilgrimage had continued for centuries under successive Muslim rulers of the city, generally without serious disruption, since Islamic rule of Jerusalem, which had begun all the way back in the 7th century, had historically extended a considerable degree of practical tolerance to Christian and Jewish pilgrims and residents alike, making the Crusades' own later framing of centuries of continuous persecution something of a rhetorical exaggeration of a considerably more mixed and more complicated historical reality. There was, however, one specific and genuinely shocking episode that Western Christian memory had not forgotten by the time of Urban's own sermon, and that likely lent his appeal considerably more emotional force than an abstract complaint about pilgrim hardship alone could have provided. In the year 1009, the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, a ruler whose own erratic religious policies alarmed Muslims and Christians in his own domains in roughly equal measure, ordered the complete destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself, demolishing the building down to its very foundations in an act that sent genuine shockwaves through Western Christendom when news of it eventually arrived. Al-Hakim's own successors permitted the church's eventual reconstruction only decades later through a costly negotiated agreement with the Byzantine Empire, but the memory of that single act of deliberate destruction against Christianity's own holiest physical site lingered in Western religious memory for the better part of a century afterward, a specific, concrete grievance that Urban's own considerably broader and more sweeping rhetorical claims about the suffering of Eastern Christians could draw on for real, remembered emotional weight, even though the actual current state of Christian pilgrimage to Jerusalem by the 1090s had, if anything, been improving rather than worsening in the years immediately preceding the Crusade. He spoke of the plight of the Byzantine Christians specifically, framing Alexios's own modest request for mercenary assistance as a plea from fellow Christians under existential threat from a common enemy, and then, in the sermon's own most consequential and most historically novel turn, he called on his listeners, specifically the assembled knights and nobles of France, rather than the ordinary peasantry, to take up arms not against each other in the endless, church-condemned private warfare that had already troubled Urban's own predecessors for decades, but against the Muslim powers who held Jerusalem, promising those who undertook this armed pilgrimage a spiritual reward unlike anything the Church had ever formally offered before, a full remission of the temporal penalties owed for their own sins, an indulgence in the specific theological language the Church would spend the following century refining, that transformed the very act of fighting and dying on this particular campaign into something closer to an act of penance than an act of violence at all. It is worth pausing on how genuinely radical that offer actually was within the moral universe of 11th century Christianity, because the Church of Urban's own day had spent centuries teaching that violence, even violence undertaken in a just cause, still stained the soul of the man who committed it, and still required penance to atone for, a doctrine that had in fact been part of the whole justification behind the Peace of God movement's efforts to restrain nightly bloodshed in the first place. It is worth pausing on the specific theological tradition Urban was actually working within and quietly transforming here, because Christian thought had already possessed, for many centuries before Clermont, a well-developed theory of when warfare could be considered morally justified at all. Augustine of Hippo, writing some 7 centuries before Urban's own sermon, had laid down the foundational principles of what later theologians would call just war theory, arguing that warfare could be morally permissible only when waged by a legitimate authority, for a just cause such as defending against aggression, or righting a genuine wrong, and with the right intention of restoring peace rather than satisfying mere hatred or the desire for plunder, a framework that, crucially, still treated even a fully justified war as a regrettable necessity rather than a positive spiritual good, an act that a genuinely pious soldier ought to perform reluctantly and still, in the ordinary run of church teaching seek penance for afterward, exactly the assumption underlying the whole Peace of God movement's insistence that knightly violence stain the soul regardless of its cause. What Urban did at Clermont when examined against this older tradition was subtler and considerably more consequential than simply declaring one particular war just in the Augustinian sense. He offered something the older just war tradition had never quite provided, a war whose violence itself, rather than being merely excused or tolerated as a regrettable necessity, became a positive act of penance in its own right, its participants earning, through the killing and the suffering involved, the same kind of spiritual credit that older forms of penance, pilgrimage, fasting, almsgiving had always been understood to provide, a genuinely novel theological move that historians of religion still regard as one of the single most consequential shifts in the entire history of Western Christian thought about violence, transforming holy war almost overnight from a reluctantly tolerated necessity into an act of devotion a knight might actively seek out for the good of his own soul, a transformation whose full theological implications the Church itself would spend the following century, through the further development of crusading theory and crusading law, still working out in careful detail. The divided house of Islam. It is worth pausing too before we follow the Crusader army across the Bosphorus to explain a little more fully the political landscape of the Muslim world the Crusaders were about to march into, because the Crusades' own early successes owed a considerable debt to a division within Islam itself that the Western chroniclers, and Urban's own original call to arms, understood only dimly if at all. The Muslim world of the late 11th century was split between two rival, and often bitterly hostile centres of religious and political authority, the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, based in Baghdad but by this point largely a figurehead institution whose actual military power rested with the Seljuk Turkish sultans who had seized effective control of its territories, and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, based in Cairo and ruling Egypt and for a time portions of Syria and Palestine, a rivalry rooted in the ancient and foundational schism within Islam over the rightful succession to the Prophet Muhammad's own religious authority, a schism whose origins reach back more than 4 centuries before this crusade, and that this channel may well tell in full on its own night one day. It is worth pausing too on a separate and considerably more recent schism, this one dividing Christianity itself rather than Islam, because it shaped the whole Crusades' relationship with Byzantium every bit as much as the Sunni-Shia rivalry shaped its relationship with the Muslim world it was actually marching to fight. Only some 4 decades before Urban's own sermon at Clermont, in the year 1054, the Latin Christian Church of Rome and the Greek Orthodox Church of Constantinople had formally split from one another in an event historians call the Great Schism, when papal legates sent by Pope Leo IX, arriving in Constantinople amid a long simmering dispute over papal authority, liturgical practice, and a contested addition to the Nicene Creed itself, laid a formal bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia against the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, who responded in kind with his own excommunication of the legates, a mutual condemnation that both sides likely expected to be temporary and diplomatically reversible, but that instead hardened, over the following decades, into a permanent and genuinely bitter institutional division between the Latin and Greek, branches of a faith that had, for the preceding 1,000 years, considered itself a single, undivided church. Some historians have suggested that Urban himself may have harboured a genuine hope that a successful joint venture between Latin Crusaders and Byzantine Christians, fighting side by side against a common Muslim enemy, might help heal this still relatively fresh and still potentially reversible ecclesiastical rupture, restoring some measure of practical cooperation and mutual goodwill between Rome and Constantinople, even if the formal theological dispute remained unresolved. If any such hope genuinely motivated Urban's own thinking, the Crusades' actual course did nothing whatsoever to advance it, and a great deal to actively worsen it. The mutual accusations of bad faith and broken oaths that poisoned Crusader-Byzantine relations from the very first negotiations outside Constantinople, onward doing far more to entrench Latin and Greek Christian hostility toward one another than 4 decades of purely theological dispute had already managed. A slow deterioration that would, as we have already traced tonight, culminate exactly 1 century later in the Fourth Crusade's own catastrophic sack of Constantinople itself, an atrocity committed by Latin Christian soldiers against the greatest Christian city in the world that did more than any single event in the entire history of the schism to convince the Greek Orthodox world that formal reunion with Rome was neither possible nor any longer particularly desirable, a division between the Eastern and Western churches that remains, in its essential outline, unresolved to this very day. This Sunni-Shia rivalry meant that the Seljuk Turkish rulers whose territories the Crusaders first encountered in Anatolia, and the Fatimid Egyptian rulers who controlled Jerusalem itself by the time the Crusader army finally arrived there, regarded each other as at least as dangerous and at least as illegitimate as they regarded the invading Christian army, a mutual hostility that helps explain several of the Crusades' own most consequential strokes of good fortune, including the Fatimids' own decision to seize Jerusalem from its Seljuk garrison in 1098, only a year before the Crusaders themselves arrived to besiege it, a change of hands that left the city's own defences less prepared than they might otherwise have been, and the general absence, across nearly the entire campaign we have described tonight, of anything resembling a unified Muslim military response, individual Turkish and Arab rulers responding to the Crusader threat piecemeal, and often more concerned with their own regional rivals than with the foreign army steadily advancing through territory that, in a great many cases, did not belong to whichever ruler happened to be closest to the Crusaders' own line of march at any given moment. Urban's proposal effectively inverted that entire moral logic for this one specific campaign, telling an audience of professional warriors that the very activity they were already best trained and most eager to perform, organised armed violence, could, if directed at this one specific target, actually function as an act of religious devotion powerful enough to erase the accumulated spiritual debt of an entire lifetime of sin. And it is difficult to overstate how perfectly this offer was calibrated to the actual anxieties and the actual desires of the audience sitting in that field, a class of men who had spent their entire lives being told by the same church that their own professional occupation endangered their immortal souls, now being told that this same violence, redirected at the right target, could save those souls instead. The chroniclers agree that the crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, that men began shouting Deus vult, God wills it, a phrase that would become the movement's own rallying cry for the following 2 centuries of crusading that followed this first campaign, and that so many knights and lesser nobles came forward on the spot to formally take the cross, sewing a cloth cross onto their own garments as a public sign of their vow. That Urban's own advance planning, whatever it had actually been, was almost immediately overwhelmed by a response of a scale he appears not to have fully anticipated himself. Bishop Adhemer of Le Puy, a French clergyman who had himself already made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem once before, stepped forward as the very first to take the cross in public, and Urban, recognising in him exactly the kind of credible spiritual authority the coming expedition would need, appointed him almost immediately as his own official papal legate, the Church's own designated spiritual leader for whatever expedition was now, with startling speed, actually beginning to take shape. Urban spent the following months, after Clermont, continuing his own tour through France, preaching the same message at council after council, and commissioning other bishops and popular preachers to spread the call further still, setting a departure date of August the following year, in 1096, to give those who had taken the cross time to settle their own affairs, arrange for the management of their own estates during what everyone involved understood would be a lengthy absence, and raise the considerable funds a campaign of this scale would require. It is worth pausing on that last practical detail, because the cost of outfitting even a single knight for a campaign of this length and distance was genuinely enormous by the standards of the time. A horse, armour, weapons and provisions, requiring most lords to mortgage or sell off portions of their own land, often to the very church that was calling them to undertake the expedition in the first place, so that the Crusade, from its very earliest planning stages, was already reshaping the economic landscape of Western Europe before a single knight had even crossed the border out of his own homeland, a wandering preacher and an army that marched before it was ready. Urban's own carefully planned timeline and organised departure of trained knights and nobles in the late summer of 1096 was almost immediately overtaken by a far less organised and far more dangerous phenomenon that historians now generally call the People's Crusade, a movement led not by any of the great feudal lords Urban had specifically appealed to at Clermont, but by wandering popular preachers whose own fiery sermons, delivered across France and the Rhineland in the months following the council, whipped up a religious fervour among the ordinary peasantry, the urban poor and the lower clergy that proved impossible for anyone, including the church hierarchy that had originally set this whole movement in motion, to fully control or contain. The most famous of these preachers was a man known to history as Peter the Hermit, an itinerant monk from the region of Amiens in northern France, a small, striking figure who rode, by every contemporary account, a donkey rather than a horse, and dressed in the simple, coarse robes of an ascetic, and whose own preaching, whatever its actual theological content, generated a following among the common people of France and Germany so intense that later chroniclers reported crowds plucking hairs from his donkey's tail to keep as holy relics, treating the animal itself as though some portion of its rider's own sanctity had rubbed off onto it. Peter's own preaching drew together, with startling speed, an army that had almost nothing in common with the disciplined feudal levies Urban had actually envisioned at Clermont, a sprawling, disorganised mass of tens of thousands of poor peasants, along with a smaller number of impoverished knights, whole families travelling together with their own children and elderly relatives, people who understood the call to crusade not as a specific military campaign, requiring careful preparation and provisioning, but as something closer to an apocalyptic pilgrimage, a chance to walk in the footsteps of Christ toward Jerusalem itself before what many of them genuinely believed might be the end of the world. It is worth pausing on how differently this crowd understood its own undertaking compared to the knights Urban had specifically targeted at Clermont, because that difference in understanding is going to explain nearly everything that went wrong for them in the months that followed. These were, overwhelmingly, people with no military training, no reliable source of supply, and often no clear sense of the actual geography they were about to cross, driven forward by a genuine and intense religious conviction that God himself would provide for their needs along the way, exactly as Scripture described him providing manna for the Israelites wandering in the desert, a belief that would be tested and found catastrophically wanting, almost as soon as this same crowd actually began to move. It is worth pausing on exactly why this particular moment in the 11th century produced such an unusually receptive audience for apocalyptic preaching among the ordinary peasantry of France and Germany, because Urban's own call did not fall on a population with no prior expectation of dramatic, world-altering religious events. Several contemporary chroniclers describe a genuine surge of anxious portent reading in the years and months immediately preceding the Crusade, a notable comet visible in the skies over Europe in 1095 itself, along with reports of a meteor shower and, in at least one chronicler's account, a lunar eclipse that ordinary people across the countryside interpreted, in the absence of any other explanatory framework readily available to them, as unmistakable signs that God was preparing to intervene directly and dramatically in human history. This was a population already primed by a broader medieval Christian culture that took the biblical book of Revelation with real, literal seriousness, and that had, across the preceding several centuries, periodically produced waves of popular apocalyptic expectation whenever a comet, a famine, or some other unsettling natural event seemed to align suggestively with scriptural prophecy, and Urban's call to march to Jerusalem itself, the specific city where Christian eschatology held that Christ would return at the end of days, landed on exactly this kind of primed and anxious popular imagination, with an effect that Urban, addressing an audience of knights and nobles at Clermont rather than the peasantry who would go on to follow Peter the Hermit, may not have fully anticipated or intended, a reminder that a message launched by one speaker into one specific and carefully targeted audience rarely travels onward through a wider and more varied population in quite the form, or with quite the emphasis, its original speaker actually gave it. Before this ragged, undersupplied mass of humanity had even left Western Europe, it produced one of the darkest and most shameful episodes in this entire story, a series of massacres that historians now generally call the Rhineland massacres, in which bands of crusaders, some of them loosely affiliated with Peter the Hermit's own following, and others organised separately under lesser nobles, most infamously a German count named Emicho of Flonheim, turned their own newly stoked religious fervour not against the distant Muslim armies they claimed to be marching against, but against the long-established Jewish communities of the Rhine Valley, in cities including Speyer, Worms, Mainz and Cologne. The logic these crusaders used to justify this violence, so far as the horrified Christian chroniclers who recorded it were willing to reconstruct it, held that it made no sense to march thousands of miles to fight the supposed enemies of Christ in a distant land while leaving unconverted, and in their own deeply distorted reasoning, actively complicit communities untouched at home, a piece of theological reasoning that the Church itself had never sanctioned, and that local bishops in several of these same cities, men who bore no illusions about how thin the protection of their own authority actually was, against a crowd this large and this inflamed, attempted, at real personal risk and often at real physical cost to themselves, to prevent sheltering Jewish families in their own episcopal palaces and fortified residences. Those efforts at protection frequently failed against the sheer scale and fury of the mobs involved, and the resulting massacres killed, by the most careful modern estimates drawn from Hebrew chronicles written by survivors in the years immediately afterward, somewhere between several hundred and several thousand Jewish men, women and children across these Rhineland communities in the late spring of 1096, some victims killed outright by the mobs, and others in scenes the surviving Hebrew accounts describe with a specific and devastating clarity, choosing to take their own lives and the lives of their own children rather than submit to forced conversion or fall into the hands of the attacking crowds. The chronicle attributed to Solomon Bar Simpson, one of several such Hebrew accounts compiled in the decades following these massacres, from the testimony of survivors and the memory of the communities that endured them, records these events with a specificity that no Latin Christian chronicle of the same period bothers to match, naming individual families, individual acts of resistance, and individual moments of anguish inside the besieged Jewish quarters of Mainz and Worms in a register that reads, even across 9 centuries, as unmistakably a community's own attempt to bear witness to its own dead, rather than to celebrate anyone's triumph, the mirror opposite in tone and in purpose of everything the triumphant Latin chronicles of Jerusalem's own fall would go on to record only 3 years later. It is worth following the fate of Emicho of Flonheim himself, the German count whose own band bore the heaviest responsibility for the worst of these massacres, because contemporaries at the time, and quite a few modern historians since, have noted a certain grim symmetry in what happened to him afterward. Emicho's own force never even reached Byzantine territory, let alone Jerusalem, destroyed instead in Hungary later that same year by the forces of King Coloman, who had grown alarmed at the scale of looting and disorder this same undisciplined band had inflicted while crossing his own kingdom, and several contemporary chroniclers, including some sympathetic to the crusading movement overall, recorded this destruction with an unmistakable note of moral satisfaction, treating it as divine judgment visited on a man whose own crusading vow had been so thoroughly and so publicly dishonoured by the massacres he had presided over before ever striking a single blow against the actual enemy he claimed to be marching against. It is worth pausing on this atrocity for a long moment, because it is not a footnote to the story of the First Crusade, however briefly later more triumphalist Christian chronicles tended to treat it. It was the crusading movement's very first mass killing, carried out before a single one of these armies had even left Christian Europe, let alone encountered the Muslim forces they claimed to be marching against, and it established, in the movement's own opening weeks, a pattern of violence directed against whatever vulnerable population happened to be closest at hand that would recur in different forms at nearly every major stage of the campaign still ahead of us tonight. Peter the Hermit's own following, along with several other loosely organised bands that had gathered under lesser leaders, including a French knight named Walter Sans Avoir, pressed on eastward through Hungary and the Balkans toward Constantinople in the summer of 1096, and the journey proved almost immediately disastrous. An undisciplined mass of tens of thousands of people with inadequate supplies clashing repeatedly with the local populations of the Christian kingdoms they marched through, foraging and looting for food in ways that provoked armed retaliation from Hungarian and Byzantine forces alike, so that by the time the surviving remnants of this whole movement finally straggled into Constantinople in the late summer of 1096, they had already suffered significant losses to disease, starvation, and outright battle with the very Christian populations they were nominally marching to help defend. Emperor Alexios, confronted with the arrival of this enormous, undisciplined and increasingly hungry crowd, at the very gates of his own capital, a force bearing almost no resemblance to the organised mercenary contingents he had actually requested from the Pope, reacted with understandable alarm, providing what supplies he reasonably could while moving as quickly as possible to ferry this whole unwieldy mass across the Bosphorus into Anatolia, both to relieve the pressure on his own capital's supplies and, quite plausibly, to get a crowd this large and this potentially destabilising away from the walls of Constantinople itself before it caused any further disorder within the city. Alexios's own advisers urged Peter the Hermit to wait on the Anatolian shore for the arrival of the far better organised and better equipped noble armies that were, by this point, already beginning their own more disciplined march east. But the discipline problems that had plagued this crowd throughout its journey across the Balkans followed it across the water as well, and within weeks, against Peter's own explicit advice, and against every warning Alexios's own officers could offer about the Seljuk forces known to be active in the region, a portion of this same undisciplined host pushed further inland toward a fortified camp near a town called Siveto, raiding the surrounding Turkish-held countryside for plunder and provisions. The Seljuk Turks, under a local ruler named Kilij Arslan, who had been watching this whole undisciplined force with what the sources suggest was a mixture of alarm and calculation, moved against the Crusader camp at Siveto in October of 1096 with a swift and devastating ambush that caught the overwhelming majority of Peter the Hermit's own following entirely unprepared, slaughtering, by the estimates the surviving chroniclers offer us, the great majority of the People's Crusade in a single catastrophic morning, killing men, women and children indiscriminately, and taking a considerable number of captives for the slave markets of the Muslim world, so that the very first Western army to actually reach Anatolia, in pursuit of Urban's own call to crusade, was effectively annihilated, before the far larger and far better prepared noble armies had even finished crossing France. Peter the Hermit himself survived, having been absent from the camp negotiating with Byzantine officials at Constantinople at the exact moment of the disaster, and he would go on, in a detail this whole story treats with a certain grim irony, to accompany the much larger and more disciplined noble crusade that followed him, present at nearly every major event still ahead of us tonight, a survivor of his own movement's total destruction, who nonetheless kept walking, all the way to Jerusalem itself. 5 armies, 5 ambitious lords, and a very uncomfortable emperor. while Peter the Hermit's own following was meeting its catastrophic end near Civito. The far larger, far better equipped, and far more disciplined force that Urban had actually intended to raise at Clermont was still assembling and organising itself across the length of Western Europe, and it is worth pausing here to introduce the men who actually led it. Because unlike the People's Crusade, this second wave of departures had no single overall commander at all. A genuinely striking fact about the whole enterprise that later medieval and modern audiences alike sometimes find difficult to credit, given how large and how historically consequential the resulting campaign turned out to be. Instead, 5 or 6 largely independent noble armies, each raised, financed and commanded by its own great feudal lord, set out separately from different parts of France, Italy and the Low Countries, coordinating only loosely with one another and converging over the course of several months on Constantinople as their agreed common staging point. An arrangement that would produce, again and again across the following 3 years, exactly the kind of fractious, rivalrous, and occasionally near catastrophic disunity you would expect from an army led by 5 separate and roughly equally ranked commanders who each answered, in the end, only to their own ambition and their own conscience. The most senior of these leaders in terms of pure aristocratic rank was Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, an older and already very wealthy nobleman from southern France, who had notably already made his own earlier pilgrimage to Spain to fight against the Muslim kingdoms there, and who brought to the crusade both his own very substantial financial resources and a personal piety that several chroniclers describe as considerably more genuine and less calculating than that of some of his fellow commanders, a man who would remain committed to the campaign's religious purpose, by most accounts, more consistently than almost anyone else among the leadership, even at real cost to his own political interests along the way. Travelling separately from northern France came Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, alongside his brother Baldwin of Boulogne, 2 men whose very different temperaments and very different subsequent fates would matter enormously to the story still ahead of us tonight. Godfrey remembered by history as pious, restrained, and personally courageous in battle, and Baldwin remembered as considerably more ambitious and considerably less sentimental about the whole religious framing of the enterprise, a distinction that would become extremely important once actual territory in the east began to be won, and someone had to decide who would actually rule it. From southern Italy came Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince whose own family had, only a generation before, carved out an entire kingdom for themselves in Sicily and southern Italy through nothing more than their own considerable military talent and their own considerable ruthlessness. And Bohemond, the eldest son of the legendary Norman adventurer Robert Guiscard, brought with him a reputation for battlefield cunning that the Byzantines themselves had already encountered directly and painfully, because Bohemond's own father had, only a decade or so earlier, actually invaded Byzantine territory in the Balkans in an attempt to carve out his own piece of the empire, a war in which Bohemond himself had fought as a young commander against the very same Emperor Alexios he was now, somewhat awkwardly, marching to assist. It is worth pausing on that history, because it means that when Bohemond arrived at Constantinople as one of the Crusade's most capable and most ambitious commanders, he was doing so as a man who had personally fought a war of conquest against his own host only a few years earlier, a fact that neither man could have been under any illusions about, however diplomatically both of them chose to behave toward each other in the months that followed. Before we follow these armies across the Bosphorus, it is worth pausing on the 2 men whose own personal courage the surviving chronicles single out most consistently among all the Crusade's various commanders, because the legends that grew up around them in the years immediately following the campaign tell us something about what medieval audiences themselves considered the single most admirable quality a leader of this kind of expedition could possess. Godfrey of Bouillon, whose own later refusal of a royal crown at Jerusalem we will come to shortly, was already, by the time the army reached Anatolia, acquiring a reputation for battlefield feats that bordered on the superhuman, even by the generous standards medieval chroniclers generally applied to their own favoured commanders. one widely repeated story describing him, during a hunting expedition undertaken to supplement the army's own dwindling supplies, single-handedly killing a bear that had mauled one of his own companions, and another, considerably more famous story claiming that in one engagement he cut a fleeing Turkish soldier clean in half with a single stroke of his own sword, the upper half of the body falling from the man's own horse, while the lower half, in the story's own deliberately startling detail, remained upright in the saddle for several more strides before finally toppling, a tale that almost certainly grew in the telling with each retelling, but that tells us plainly enough what qualities the men who fought alongside Godfrey, and the audiences back home who heard these stories afterward, most wanted to believe about the leader God had apparently chosen to guide them. Bohemond's own nephew, a young and remarkably talented soldier named Tancred, accompanied him and would go on to become one of the campaign's most consistently effective battlefield commanders across the whole of the following 3 years. Remembered by the chroniclers as the army's most daring and most reliable leader of smaller detached forces, frequently entrusted with scouting missions and rapid strikes that the main army's own more senior and more cautious leadership preferred not to risk their own core strength on, a young man who would go on within little more than a decade to govern the Principality of Antioch as regent during his own uncle's later captivity among the Turks, ranked by several modern historians among the single most capable pieces of Crusader generalship this entire campaign produced. Rounding out the Crusade's senior leadership were Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy, and the eldest son of William the Conqueror, who had mortgaged his own duchy to his younger brother, King William II of England, to raise the funds for the expedition, and Robert II, Count of Flanders, along with Stephen of Blois, a wealthy but by most contemporary accounts considerably less martially inclined nobleman, whose own letters home to his wife Adela, herself a daughter of William the Conqueror, survive today as some of the single most valuable first-hand sources we possess for the Crusades' early stages, an accidental historical gift from a man whose own personal courage, as we will discover later tonight, would eventually prove considerably less reliable than his correspondence. These various armies, travelling by different overland and sea routes through the Balkans and across the Adriatic, began arriving at Constantinople between the winter of 1096 and the spring of 1097, and their arrival presented Emperor Alexios with a diplomatic problem of real delicacy, because he now found camped outside the walls of his own capital not the modest force of mercenaries he had originally requested, but several tens of thousands of armed Western European soldiers, led by men including Bohemond, whose own family had so recently made war on the Empire directly, and Alexios, whatever his own private anxieties, understood that his own long-term interest depended on securing some formal, binding commitment from these various lords before allowing their combined forces to cross into Anatolia, because a wandering army of this size, entirely outside imperial control and potentially hostile to Byzantine interests, camped at the edge of his own territory, was every bit as dangerous to him as the Turkish forces it had ostensibly come to fight. Alexios' solution, negotiated individually and with varying degrees of difficulty with each of the Crusade's separate leaders as they arrived, was to require an oath of fealty, a formal feudal promise that any territory the Crusaders managed to reconquer from the Turks that had previously belonged to the Byzantine Empire would be restored to imperial control rather than kept by whichever Crusader lord happened to capture it, an arrangement that made a great deal of sense from Alexios' own perspective, since his original goal had, after all, simply been to recover his own empire's lost Anatolian territory, but that sat very uneasily with a number of the Crusades' own leaders, several of whom, Bohemond most conspicuously among them, appear to have accepted the oath's terms with considerably less sincere intention of actually honouring it than Alexios himself might have hoped. Godfrey of Bouillon reportedly required the most persuading of all the assembled lords, at one point provoking an actual, if brief, military confrontation with Byzantine forces outside the city walls, before eventually agreeing, under considerable pressure from his own fellow commanders, to swear the oath, while Raymond of Toulouse, alone among the major leaders, managed to negotiate a somewhat softened version of the pledge, offering only to respect the emperor's life and honour, rather than swearing the full and specific oath of vassalage the other lords eventually accepted, Alexios, for his own part, provided the crusading armies with substantial supplies, guides familiar with the Anatolian terrain and the disposition of Turkish forces, and a Byzantine military contingent under a trusted general to accompany the expedition, a genuine and considerable investment of imperial resources that later, more hostile Western chroniclers, writing after the alliance between Byzantines and Crusaders had curdled badly over the years that followed, would nonetheless choose to remember selectively, emphasizing Byzantine caution and self-interest while quietly downplaying, or in some cases omitting entirely, just how much material and logistical support Alexios' empire actually provided at this earliest and most genuinely cooperative stage of the whole campaign, before the accumulating grievances of the years ahead had any chance to poison the story either side would eventually choose to tell about it. It is worth pausing on this mutual suspicion, present already at the very outset of the joint venture between Crusaders and Byzantines, because it never really went away across the following 3 years, and it would eventually curdle into outright hostility that shaped the Crusader state's relationship with Constantinople for generations afterward, a slow poisoning of trust between supposed allies that began here, in these tense negotiations outside the walls of Constantinople. Long before either side had even engaged the Turkish enemy, they had nominally joined forces to defeat. A city surrendered behind the Crusaders' backs. With the various oaths sworn, however grudgingly, the combined Crusader armies crossed the Bosphorus into Anatolia in the spring of 1097, and their very first major objective was the city of Nicaea, a wealthy and heavily fortified city that had, in one of the more pointed ironies of this whole conflict, served as the site of the great Christian Church Council some 7.5 centuries earlier that had produced the Nicene Creed, a foundational statement of Christian belief still recited in churches across the world today, and that now stood as the capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan, the very ruler whose forces had annihilated Peter the Hermit's People's Crusade at Siveto only months before. Kilij Arslan, confident after his earlier victory that this new crusading force posed no greater threat than the undisciplined rabble he had so recently destroyed, was campaigning elsewhere when the Crusader host arrived and laid siege to Nicaea in May of 1097, and he returned in haste to relieve the city, only to be defeated in a hard-fought battle outside its walls, a genuine and sobering demonstration to the Seljuk leadership that this second wave of Crusaders, whatever their religious motivations, represented a far more formidable and far better disciplined military force than the peasant army he had so easily crushed the previous autumn. It is worth following Kilij Arslan's own subsequent career briefly, because his story did not end with the loss of his own capital, and it offers a useful reminder that this whole campaign, however central it looms in Western historical memory, was for a ruler like him only one episode, if a genuinely significant one, in a much longer career spent contesting power across Anatolia against a whole rotating cast of rivals. Having lost Nicaea and suffered further defeat at Dorylaeum, Kilij Arslan withdrew deeper into central Anatolia, relocating his own capital and continuing to rule what history would come to call the Sultanate of Rum for nearly a decade afterward, engaging in his own continuing wars against rival Turkish and Danish-mend rulers largely independent of the Crusader states he had first encountered, until he was finally killed in battle in 1107, fighting forces loyal to the great Seljuk Sultan, a death that had nothing at all to do with the Crusaders who had first made his own name so widely known in the West, a small reminder that for the Muslim rulers whose own territories this campaign passed through, the Crusade was very often only one difficult season among a great many other, equally pressing regional struggles. It is worth pausing, here at this first serious siege of the campaign, to say a word about how medieval siege warfare of this kind actually worked in practice, because it is going to matter enormously across nearly every major episode still ahead of us tonight, and it operated on principles considerably more patient and considerably more grinding than a modern audience raised on dramatic cinematic battles might expect. A well-built medieval city wall of the kind Nicaea, and later Antioch and Jerusalem all possessed, was not something a medieval army could simply smash through with brute force in an afternoon. Attackers generally relied on a fairly limited toolkit, siege towers, tall wooden structures built on wheels or rollers and pushed up against a wall so that soldiers could cross directly from the tower's own upper platform onto the ramparts, a slow and dangerous process requiring the tower to survive fire, thrown stones, and Greek fire long enough to actually reach the wall it was aimed at. Undermining, in which engineers dug tunnels beneath a wall's own foundations, shoring up the resulting cavity with wooden props and then setting the props alight, causing the tunnel and the wall above it to collapse, and battering rams and simple scaling ladders for more direct assaults, where the terrain and the defender's own preparedness allowed it. Torsion and counterweight engines, mangonels and the more powerful trebuchets whose fullest development actually came somewhat later in the medieval period, hurled stones and, on the defender's own side quite as often as the attackers, the terrifying incendiary weapon known as Greek fire, a Byzantine invention whose exact chemical composition remains disputed among modern historians to this day, but that burned, by every contemporary account, with a ferocity that ordinary water could not extinguish, spreading real and justified terror through any army it was turned against. Given this limited toolkit, a fortified city with a determined garrison, adequate supplies, and walls in good repair could very often outlast a besieging army's own patience, and, just as often, its own supply situation, particularly since a besieging force large enough to properly invest a major city needed to feed and water itself from the surrounding countryside for as long as the siege continued, a countryside that grew steadily less able to support that same army the longer any siege dragged on, meaning that sieges of this era were won, as often as not through any dramatic breach of the walls at all, but through the much slower and much less cinematic arithmetic of starvation, disease, and morale, whichever side, attacker or defender, ran out of food, water, or the will to continue first. It is worth carrying that whole grinding, patient calculus with us into the far larger and far more consequential siege, still waiting for this same army at Antioch, because nearly everything that happened there, the desperate months of hunger, the desertions and the eventual resort to treachery from within, rather than any triumphant breach from without, follows directly from exactly this same basic arithmetic of medieval siege warfare playing out on a considerably larger and considerably more desperate scale. The siege that followed was a long, grinding affair, the Crusaders constructing siege engines and attempting to storm walls that Nicaea's Byzantine builders had, in earlier centuries, made genuinely formidable, and the whole effort was complicated considerably by the fact that the city bordered a large lake on one side, allowing its Turkish garrison to receive supplies and reinforcements by water, even while the Crusaders controlled every approach by land. A problem the Crusaders eventually solved only with direct Byzantine assistance, Alexios's own forces bringing boats overland and launching them onto the lake to seal off the city's final avenue of resupply. It was the resolution of this siege, in June of 1097, that produced the first serious crack in the always uneasy alliance between the Crusaders and their Byzantine hosts, because rather than allowing the Crusader army to storm the city and claim it, and its considerable wealth, through direct conquest, Alexios negotiated a secret separate surrender with the city's own garrison, allowing Nicaea to capitulate quietly to Byzantine forces rather than falling to a Crusader assault at all, a manoeuvre that spared the city's population the kind of sack and plunder that a direct Crusader storming would very likely have produced, but that left a great many of the Crusader rank and file who had endured weeks of hard and costly siege warfare expecting the customary reward of plunder that medieval soldiers generally considered their due after a successful siege, feeling cheated of the spoils they believed they had rightfully earned. It is worth pausing on this moment, small as it might seem beside the much larger battle still ahead of us tonight, because it set a pattern of mutual resentment between Crusaders and Byzantines. Ordinary soldiers convinced that their Greek allies were more interested in quietly reclaiming their own former territory than in genuinely supporting the Crusades' larger religious mission that would recur and intensify at nearly every subsequent stage of the campaign. A desperate morning near Dorylaeum and a battle nearly lost before it was won. Having secured Nicaea, the Crusader army now organised into two roughly parallel marching columns to ease the logistical burden of moving so many tens of thousands of soldiers, animals, and camp followers across difficult terrain, continued its advance deeper into Anatolia, and it was near the town of Dorylaeum at the end of June in 1097 that Kilij Arslan, having regrouped his own forces and allied himself with several other regional Turkish leaders, attempted to destroy the crusading army through exactly the kind of tactics that had already worked so devastatingly well against Peter the Hermit's peasant army. A swift, mobile assault of mounted horse archers designed to encircle and annihilate an enemy force through a hail of arrows delivered at a distance that conventional heavily armoured Western knights, trained overwhelmingly for direct close-quarters cavalry charges, had no obvious answer to. The Turkish attack fell first on the smaller of the two Crusader columns, commanded by Bohemond, catching his forces still making camp and setting off a desperate, hours-long defensive action in which Bohemond's own considerable tactical skill proved genuinely decisive, ordering his infantry and non-combatants to form a defensive perimeter around the column's own baggage and camp followers, while his cavalry and smaller disciplined sorties held the perimeter against wave after wave of Turkish horse archers, a defence that came, by the account of several chroniclers who were present, extremely close to collapsing entirely under the sheer weight and persistence of the Turkish assault before relief finally arrived. That relief came in the form of the Crusade's second column, marching under Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse, who, alerted to Bohemond's desperate situation, force-marched their own troops to the sound of battle and arrived on the Turkish flank at the critical moment, catching Kilij Arslan's own forces between two Crusader columns and turning what had very nearly become a catastrophic defeat into a decisive Crusader victory, the Turkish forces breaking and fleeing the field, abandoning their own camp and considerable supplies to the victorious Crusaders. It is worth pausing on how close this single battle came to ending the entire crusade only weeks after it had properly begun, because a defeat of the scale Bohemond's column very nearly suffered, with the Crusade's various leaders and their forces still spread out and only partially coordinated, could easily have proven as catastrophic to the noble crusade as Cívico had already proven to Peter the Hermit's peasant army. And it is worth noting too that the victory at Dorylaeum taught the Crusader leadership a genuinely important tactical lesson that would serve them across the remainder of the campaign, that their own heavy cavalry, so devastating in a direct charge, needed to operate in close coordination with disciplined infantry, and with a unified command structure capable of reinforcing a threatened position quickly, rather than allowing separate columns to march far enough apart that a mobile enemy could isolate and destroy them individually, a lesson that would matter enormously in the much larger and much more consequential battles still waiting for this same army outside the walls of Antioch. A summer march through a land with no water. The victory at Dorylaeum opened the road deeper into Anatolia, but it did not open at an easy one, and it is worth pausing on the march that followed, across the high, arid plateau of central Anatolia in the very height of summer, because the ordinary hardship of that crossing killed, by most modern estimates, a considerable number of Crusaders through nothing more dramatic than heat, thirst, and simple exhaustion, a toll that the chroniclers who survived it recorded with a specific, almost obsessive attention to the physical suffering involved, describing horses and pack animals dying by the hundreds for lack of water and forage, and soldiers reduced to drinking their own animals' blood or the brackish contents of muddy ditches in the absence of anything better. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, marching with the army himself, recording plainly that many among their number, women, men and small children alike, simply drop dead by the roadside from thirst in the worst stretches of that crossing, their bodies left where they fell because the column could not afford the time or the water to spare for proper burial while the sun climbed higher, and the next spring, if there even was one, still lay an unknown distance ahead, a level of physical deprivation that fell no less heavily on the campaign's leadership than on its ordinary soldiers, since even a count or a duke's own rank offered no real protection against a landscape that simply did not contain enough water to support an army of this size passing through it in the middle of July and August. It was during this same gruelling crossing that the Crusades' unified command structure, always more a matter of temporary cooperation between independent rivals than any genuine single leadership, produced its first significant strategic divergence, when Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's own brother, broke away from the main army with a smaller contingent of his own knights and struck out toward Edessa, a wealthy Armenian Christian city well to the east of the main Crusader route, invited there, according to the sources, by its own ruler, an Armenian prince who hoped a contingent of Western knights might help stabilise his own precarious position against surrounding Turkish pressure. Baldwin's own motives in undertaking this detour appear, by nearly every account, to have owed considerably less to religious devotion than to plain and considerable personal ambition, and the venture succeeded beyond what even Baldwin himself might have initially hoped, because within a matter of months, through a combination of military assistance to the city's ruler, and, according to several sources, a rather more direct and considerably less honourable role in that same ruler's subsequent death, Baldwin found himself installed as the new ruler of Edessa in his own right, establishing, in March of 1098, the county of Edessa, the very first of what would become 4 separate Crusader states, carved out of formerly Byzantine and Muslim-held territory in the Near East. It is worth pausing on the founding of Edessa for a moment, because it establishes, this early in the campaign and well before the Crusaders had even reached their supposed ultimate objective of Jerusalem, exactly the pattern of behaviour that would define the whole rest of this expedition's relationship to the territory it was passing through. Individual Crusader lords, whatever their own genuine religious devotion, consistently proved willing to break away from the collective enterprise the moment a genuine opportunity for personal territorial gain presented itself, carving out independent lordships for themselves rather than simply restoring conquered territory to Byzantine control as their own sworn oaths to Alexios had specifically promised, a pattern Edessa established first, and that Antioch, in the far larger and far more consequential drama still ahead of us tonight, would repeat on a considerably grander scale. The siege that would not end. The main body of the Crusader army, meanwhile, continued its own difficult march southeast, crossing the Taurus mountains in conditions the chroniclers describe as scarcely less punishing than the desert heat that had preceded them, men and horses alike slipping from narrow mountain paths in a passage so treacherous that several sources describe knights simply abandoning armour and equipment they could no longer carry until the army finally arrived, in October of 1097, before the walls of the great city of Antioch, and it is here, before those walls, that the Crusade would spend the better part of the following 9 months in what became, by any measure, the single longest, most costly, and most dramatically eventful episode of the entire campaign. Antioch was not an ordinary target. It was one of the 5 great patriarchal sees of the ancient Christian Church, a city where, according to the Acts of the Apostles, the followers of Jesus had first been called Christians, a metropolis that had, at the height of the Roman Empire, ranked among the greatest cities of the ancient world, and that remained, even in its somewhat reduced 11th century state, a formidable fortress city protected by walls that ran for miles along the surrounding mountainside, studded with hundreds of defensive towers and enclosing enough farmland within their own circuit that a well-provisioned garrison could, in principle, withstand a siege of almost indefinite length. The city's Turkish governor, a capable and determined commander named Yagi Sian, had held the city for over a decade and had used the months of warning the Crusaders' slow approach through Anatolia had given him to strengthen his own defences and appeal for reinforcement from neighbouring Muslim rulers, understanding correctly that Antioch's fall would open the road to Syria and Palestine beyond it, and that its successful defence might well break the crusading army entirely before it ever reached its ultimate destination. It is worth pausing on the sheer physical scale of what the Crusaders were actually attempting here, because Antioch's walls ran, by the most careful modern surveys of their surviving remains, something on the order of 12 kilometres in total circuit, studded with several hundred individual towers along their length, a fortification so vast that no besieging army of this size, even one numbering in the tens of thousands, could realistically hope to surround and seal it completely, meaning that supplies and occasional reinforcement continued reaching the city's defenders throughout a considerable portion of the siege, despite the Crusaders' own best efforts. One more piece of the plain physical arithmetic that turned this single siege into the longest and most costly episode of the entire campaign. The siege that followed, stretching from October of 1097 through June of the following year, tested the Crusader army in ways that even the desert crossing and the desperate morning at Dorylaeum had not, because a besieging army large enough to invest a fortress of Antioch's own enormous scale, particularly one that could not fully seal off every approach given the length and the mountainous terrain of the city's own walls, faced a slow and grinding crisis of its own supply that steadily worsened as the surrounding countryside, thoroughly foraged and stripped bare within the first weeks of the siege, ceased to provide anything like adequate food for an army numbering, even after the losses of the march so far, well into the tens of thousands, a problem that only compounded itself further as winter approached, and the foraging parties the army depended on had to range steadily farther afield, at steadily greater risk, to find anything left worth bringing back to camp at all. Winter brought rain, cold, and worsening disease to a camp already suffering from malnutrition, and the chroniclers who lived through it describe conditions of genuine desperation. Soldiers, and even some of the lesser nobility reduced to eating their own horses, and in the most extreme accounts, scavenging among the dead, a foreshadowing of a still more horrifying episode of outright cannibalism that would occur later in the campaign at a smaller siege further south. Desertions, meanwhile, became a serious and recurring problem, with even some senior figures, most notably Stephen of Blois, the same nobleman whose letters home to his wife had so faithfully documented the campaign's earlier triumphs, eventually abandoning the siege entirely in its later stages, convinced, based on what he could see of the army's dwindling strength and worsening supply situation, that the whole expedition was doomed to fail. A traitor inside the walls, and a city won by night. It was Bohemond, ever the most calculating and the most ambitious of the Crusade's senior leaders, who finally broke the deadlock, and it is worth telling the story of exactly how he did it, because the method he used tells us a great deal about both his own considerable cunning and the ruthless transactional politics that would soon follow directly from it. Bohemond made secret contact with an Armenian officer inside Antioch's own garrison, a man the Latin sources call Firuz, who commanded a section of the city's fortifications and who, for reasons the sources describe variously as personal grievance against Yagi Sian, financial inducement, or some combination of both, agreed to allow Crusader forces to scale the walls under his own section of the defences under cover of darkness. Before revealing this arrangement to his fellow commanders, Bohemond first extracted a crucial concession from them, proposing, at a council of the Crusades' leaders held as the siege dragged into its 9th month with morale and supplies both nearly exhausted, that whichever commander actually secured the city's fall should be granted lordship over it outright, a proposal the other lords, desperate for any path out of a siege that seemed increasingly likely to destroy the entire army through simple attrition regardless of who eventually took credit for ending it, reluctantly accepted, with the notable exception of Raymond of Toulouse, who objected on the grounds that any such arrangement directly violated the oaths every one of them had sworn to Emperor Alexios back at Constantinople. promising to restore any reconquered former Byzantine territory to imperial control rather than keeping it for themselves. Raymond's objection was overruled by the sheer practical desperation of the moment, and in the early hours of the 3rd of June in 1098, Bohemond's men scaled the walls at Firuz's own section under cover of darkness, opened a postern gate from within, and the Crusader army poured into the city, taking Antioch in a night assault that ended, as so many medieval sieges of cities taken by storm did, in a chaotic and largely indiscriminate slaughter of much of the city's own population, Muslim and native Christian residents alike falling victim to Crusader soldiers who, after 8 months of starvation and suffering outside these same walls, showed little inclination to distinguish carefully between combatants and civilians once the gates were finally open. Yagisian himself fled the city in the chaos of that same night, and was killed shortly afterward by local villagers who recognised him, his severed head eventually brought back to the Crusader camp as a grim trophy of the army's own hard-won victory. And it seemed, for one brief moment as dawn broke over a city finally in Crusader hands after 9 months of siege, that the worst of this whole ordeal might finally be over. It was, instead, about to become very much worse, because the Crusader army had captured the city's fortifications, but had not captured its inner citadel, a separate and still defended stronghold that continued to hold out under a portion of the original garrison, and because a massive Muslim relief force, gathered by a powerful regional atabeg named Kaboga, ruler of Mosul, and drawn from a wide coalition of Muslim princes alarmed by the Crusaders' continued advance, arrived outside Antioch's own walls only days after the city had finally fallen, transforming the Crusaders, within the span of less than a week, from a besieging army that had finally won its objective into a besieged garrison, trapped inside a city whose food stores, already exhausted by the defenders during the preceding 9 months, could not begin to sustain the Crusader army, now suddenly penned inside the very walls it had just captured. A lance found in the dirt, and a battle fought on empty stomachs. It is worth pausing on the sheer, almost theatrical reversal of fortune this represented, because an army that had just endured 9 months of grinding siege warfare to capture a city now found itself besieged in turn, trapped between Kaboa's relief force outside the walls and the still defiant garrison holding out in the citadel above them, facing starvation conditions inside Antioch's own walls considerably worse than anything the army had suffered outside them. Contemporary accounts describing Crusader soldiers reduced to eating leaves, thistles, and the hides of their own dead animals, with morale collapsing to the point that further desertions, including, in one particularly demoralising episode, a nighttime escape by a group of soldiers who lowered themselves down the city walls on ropes rather than face what seemed like an inevitable final catastrophe, a group later derisively nicknamed the Rope Dancers by the chroniclers who recorded their flight. It was in this atmosphere of near-total despair that one of the most religiously and historically significant and most fiercely disputed episodes of the entire Crusade occurred, when a low-ranking pilgrim and visionary named Peter Bartholomew came forward claiming to have received a series of visions from St. Andrew the Apostle, revealing to him the location, buried beneath the floor of Antioch's own Cathedral of St. Peter, of the Holy Lance. The very spear tradition held had pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion. Peter Bartholomew's claims were met with real scepticism among portions of the Crusader leadership. Bishop Adhema of Le Puy, the Pope's own official legate, and by most accounts the most level-headed and religiously credible figure among the entire expedition's leadership, reportedly harbouring genuine doubts about the visionary's own credibility. But Raymond of Toulouse, whose own forces happened to control the section of the city where the cathedral stood, embraced the claim with real and evident enthusiasm, and a dig was organised, and after hours of digging had produced nothing, Peter Bartholomew himself descended into the excavated pit, and according to the eyewitnesses present, emerged holding a piece of iron that he declared to be the Holy Lance itself, whatever the object's actual origin, and modern historians overwhelmingly regard the discovery as either a deliberate fraud or, at best, a case of genuine but misplaced religious fervour, finding exactly the sign it desperately needed to find. The psychological effect on the starving, terrified Crusader army trapped inside Antioch's own walls was immediate and profound, transforming an army on the verge of total collapse into one convinced, with a fervour that several chroniclers describe in almost ecstatic terms, that God himself had provided them with unmistakable proof of his own continued favour at the precise moment they needed it most. Bolstered by this new and desperately needed morale, an understanding that continued passive endurance inside a starving city could only end in disaster, the Crusader leadership resolved on a desperate gamble, marching the bulk of their own remaining forces, weakened by months of starvation but now genuinely fired by religious conviction, out through the city gates on the 28th of June in 1098 to offer open battle against Kaboga's considerably larger relief army, rather than continue waiting for a siege that could only end in the Crusaders' own eventual starvation. The battle that followed proved, against what any reasonable assessment of the two armies' relative strength and condition would have predicted, a decisive Crusader victory owing, by most historical accounts, to a combination of factors beyond mere religious fervour, including significant and long-standing divisions within Kaboga's own coalition of allied Muslim princes, several of whom harboured real distrust of Kaboga's own ambitions and fought with considerably less than their full commitment, and the Crusaders' own disciplined tactical execution, advancing in coordinated formations that prevented Kaboga's own numerically superior forces from ever fully encircling or isolating individual Crusader contingents, the way Turkish forces had so nearly succeeded in doing at Dorylaeum the previous year. Kaboga's army broke and fled the field, abandoning an enormous quantity of supplies and equipment to the victorious, half-starved Crusaders, and Antioch's own remaining citadel garrison, seeing the relief force on which their own continued resistance depended routed and scattered, finally surrendered as well, bringing this whole extraordinary 9-month ordeal, siege followed by counter-siege followed by desperate battle, to its final conclusion. It is worth following the story of the Holy Lance itself a little further than its own moment of triumphant discovery, because the object's authenticity did not remain unquestioned for very long after the battle it had supposedly helped win, and its own final chapter is one of the more genuinely tragic footnotes of this entire campaign. Doubts about Peter Bartholomew's own visions persisted among a considerable portion of the Crusader leadership even after the victory over Kaboga, doubts that hardened further once Bishop Adhema of Le Puy, the one figure whose own scepticism had carried real institutional weight, died of illness only weeks later, and the dispute grew serious enough, months afterward, as the army's march stalled amid the leadership's quarrelling. We are about to describe that Peter Bartholomew himself, his own credibility now under open and hostile challenge from a rival clergyman travelling with the army, volunteered to prove the relic's authenticity, and by extension his own truthfulness, through a trial by ordeal, walking through a narrow corridor of blazing fire while holding the lance itself, on the understanding that God would preserve an innocent and truthful man from any real harm. Peter Bartholomew underwent this ordeal in April of 1099, before a crowd of the assembled army, and emerged from the flames alive but severely burned, and accounts of what his survival actually proved diverged sharply along exactly the lines of loyalty you would expect. Raymond of Toulouse's own supporters declaring the ordeal a clear vindication of the relic's sanctity, while sceptics in the Norman camp pointed to Peter Bartholomew's own severe injuries as proof of the opposite. Peter Bartholomew himself died of those same burns within a matter of days, and it is worth pausing on how quietly and how anticlimactically this whole episode, which had done so much to save a starving army's collapsing morale at the very moment it needed saving most, was allowed to simply fade from the centre of the story once its own central figure was gone, the Holy Lance itself continuing to be venerated by Raymond of Toulouse's own followers for the remainder of the campaign, but never again invoked with quite the same electrifying army-saving urgency it had carried in the desperate spring of 1098, a promise broken, and a prince who would not give back what he had won. The aftermath of this victory produced the Crusades' single most significant and most consequential breach of the oaths sworn back at Constantinople, because Bohemond, invoking the agreement the other lords had reluctantly granted him during the depths of the siege, refused to hand Antioch over to Byzantine control as the original oath to Alexios had specified, installing himself instead as the city's own independent prince. And it is worth pausing on the specific justification Bohemond and his supporters offered for this breach, because it reveals something genuinely important about how quickly the Crusaders' own relationship with their Byzantine allies had curdled over the preceding year. Alexios, they argued, had failed to fulfill his own obligations under the original oath by not personally marching to Antioch's relief during the siege, a charge that conveniently ignored the fact that the emperor had in fact set out toward Antioch with a relief force of his own, only to turn back after receiving what proved to be inaccurate reports from the very same fleeing Stephen of Blois, among others, that the Crusader army trapped inside the city was already doomed and beyond any hope of rescue. It is worth adding too that Bohemond's own case for breaking his oath had already been considerably strengthened, in the eyes of many of his fellow Crusaders, by an earlier and separately damaging episode, because Alexios had assigned a trusted Byzantine general named Tychios to accompany the crusading army as his own personal representative and liaison throughout the campaign, and Tychios had withdrawn from the Siege of Antioch in its early months, in February of 1098, citing, by his own explanation, the need to gather additional imperial reinforcements, but never actually returning to rejoin the army for the remainder of the siege, an absence that Bohemond and his supporters seized on afterward as further proof, however self-servingly deployed, that Byzantine commitment to the Crusades' own success had been half-hearted at best, precisely when the army had needed it most. Raymond of Toulouse, alone among the senior Crusader leadership, continued to insist, at real cost to his own relationship with the rest of the army's command, that the oath to Alexios remained binding, and that Antioch ought properly to be restored to Byzantine control, a principled stand that won him little practical support from fellow lords who could see, plainly enough, the value of the precedent Bohemond was establishing for their own future ambitions, and the dispute over Antioch's status would continue to poison relations both among the Crusades' own leadership and between the Crusaders collectively and the Byzantine Empire for years, indeed for generations to come, establishing the Principality of Antioch as the second of the Crusader states, and cementing in the process a founding precedent that the Crusaders' own solemn oaths to their Byzantine hosts carried real weight only for as long as honouring them remained convenient. A long delay, and a horror at Ma'ara that even the chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record. Having secured Antioch, the crusading army might reasonably have been expected to press on quickly toward Jerusalem, the ostensible goal of the entire enterprise from Urban's own original sermon at Clermont. But instead the army remained encamped in and around the region for months, weakened by an outbreak of disease that claimed, among a great many lesser figures, the life of Bishop Adhemer of Le Puy himself in early August of 1098, a loss the whole army mourned genuinely, and that removed, at a critical juncture, the one senior figure whose religious authority had carried enough weight to help mediate the increasingly bitter disputes among the Crusades' rival noble commanders, disputes that, freed now of Adhemar's own moderating presence, escalated into open quarrelling, most bitterly between Bohemond, determined to hold on to his new principality, and Raymond of Toulouse, equally determined to prevent him from doing so. It was in the midst of this leadership paralysis, with the rank-and-file soldiers growing increasingly restless and increasingly convinced that their own noble commanders' personal territorial ambitions were delaying a pilgrimage many of the ordinary Crusaders had undertaken in the sincere belief that Jerusalem itself, not Antioch or any other conquered city, was their true and only destination, that Raymond of Toulouse, hoping to break the deadlock and reassert his own leadership through decisive action, led a portion of the army south to besiege the town of Ma'arat al-Numan in November of 1098, a siege that concluded, after several weeks of hard fighting, in the city's capture in December, and that produced, in its immediate aftermath, one of the single most horrifying episodes recorded anywhere in the entire history of this campaign. With the surrounding countryside stripped bare by months of continuous foraging, and the army's supply situation once again reaching a state of genuine desperation, several contemporary Latin chroniclers, including participants who were present and recorded the events in their own first-hand accounts rather than in second-hand rumour, describe Crusader soldiers resorting to cannibalism, cutting flesh from the bodies of dead Muslims, in some accounts already buried and exhumed for the purpose, and cooking and eating it to survive the winter's continued starvation. It is worth pausing on how starkly and how plainly these chroniclers, writing for an audience that generally celebrated the Crusades' own religious righteousness, without much apparent embarrassment recorded this specific atrocity, one source describing the act with an almost clinical bluntness that has troubled and fascinated historians ever since, because it suggests an army so reduced by suffering that ordinary human taboo had simply given way entirely to the plain animal fact of survival, and it stands, alongside the Rhineland massacres at the campaign's very outset, as one of the two atrocities that this whole crusading narrative, so eager elsewhere to celebrate its own soldiers' piety and heroism, could not entirely manage to soften or explain away, even in its own most sympathetic retellings. It was only in January of 1099, with the ordinary soldiers' own patience for their leaders' continued political quarrelling finally exhausted, that outright pressure from the rank and file, several accounts describing soldiers threatening to tear down the walls of Ma'ara itself and march on Jerusalem without their own commanders if further delay continued, finally forced Raymond of Toulouse to resume the march south, the other senior lords following, some reluctantly and some, like Bohemond, choosing instead to remain behind entirely to consolidate their own new territorial holdings around Antioch, rather than continue on toward the campaign's original and increasingly distant-seeming goal, the final march, and a city finally in sight. The march south from Ma'ara through the early months of 1099 proceeded with a speed and a relative lack of the constant sieges and pitched battles that had characterized the campaign's earlier stages, in no small part because Raymond of Toulouse, now serving as the army's de facto senior commander for this final stage of the journey, pursued a deliberate policy of negotiating safe passage and provisions with several of the local Muslim rulers along the Levantine coast, rather than attempting to besiege every fortified town the army encountered, a pragmatic approach that reflected both the army's own depleted strength after nearly 2 years of continuous campaigning and losses, and the genuine eagerness, shared by leaders and ordinary soldiers alike at this stage, to reach their final objective before any further delay could produce another crisis of morale and discipline, like the one that had so nearly torn the army apart at Ma'ara. The Crusader army, its numbers now reduced by disease, battle, desertion, and the detachment of Baldwin's forces to Edessa and a portion of Bohemond's to Antioch, to perhaps only a fraction of the tens of thousands who had originally departed from Western Europe some 3 years before, some modern estimates suggesting as few as 12 to 15,000 fighting men remained by this final stage of the campaign, though estimates vary considerably, finally came within sight of the walls of Jerusalem on the 7th of June in 1099, and the chroniclers who were present describe a moment of overwhelming, tearful emotion among the assembled soldiers, men who had marched, fought, starved and buried countless companions across nearly 2,000 miles and 3 full years of campaigning, falling to their knees at their very first sight of the holy city's own walls kissing the ground and weeping openly at the sight of a destination that many among them had, by that point, genuinely doubted they would ever live to see. A city defended by a governor who understood exactly what was coming. Jerusalem itself, by the time the Crusader army arrived before its walls, was held not by the Seljuk Turks who had controlled the city for the preceding 2 decades, but by the Fatimid Caliphate, a rival Shia Muslim power based in Egypt that had, in a piece of strategic timing the Crusaders themselves could hardly have anticipated, but that worked considerably in their own favour, retaken Jerusalem from its Seljuk garrison only the previous year, meaning that the Crusader army arrived to find a Fatimid governor named Iftikhar ad-Dawla in command of a garrison that had held the city for less than 12 months, still consolidating its own hold on a population that had only just changed hands, rather than facing the kind of decades-entrenched, thoroughly prepared defence that a longer established garrison might have mounted. Iftikhar ad-Dawla, understanding correctly from reports of the Crusaders' earlier progress that a prolonged siege was likely, had nonetheless taken real and effective measures to prepare the city's defences in the months before the Crusader army's arrival, expelling much of Jerusalem's own native Christian population from the city, reportedly out of concern that they might act as a 5th column, assisting the besieging Christian army from within the walls, poisoning or filling in wells and cisterns in the surrounding countryside to deny the besiegers easy access to water in a region that, unlike the well-watered approaches to Antioch, offered very little natural water supply to sustain a large besieging army through the height of the Levantine summer, and appealing urgently to the Fatimid authorities in Egypt for the kind of relief force that had so nearly destroyed the Crusader army outside Antioch the previous year. The siege that began in early June of 1099 confronted the Crusaders with a problem that would have been familiar to them from their long ordeal at Antioch. A well-fortified city whose walls could not easily be breached by direct assault without proper siege equipment, but with none of the advantages that the long, static siege at Antioch had eventually allowed them to develop, because the Crusader army now found itself in the height of summer, in a genuinely arid landscape with little accessible water and even less timber, suitable for constructing the siege towers and scaling ladders that any serious assault on walls of this strength would require. A shortage made all the more acute because the whole surrounding countryside for miles around Jerusalem had already been thoroughly stripped of significant timber by centuries of prior settlement and cultivation. It is worth pausing, here near the very end of this long campaign, on the plain financial mechanics that had made the whole 3-year enterprise possible in the first place. Because outfitting even a single knight for a journey of this length, a warhorse or several, since horses died and had to be replaced constantly along the route, armour, weapons, and enough ready coin to purchase food and supplies across a journey that might last years rather than weeks, cost a sum that most of even the wealthier participants in this campaign could not simply produce from their own annual income. The overwhelming majority of the Crusades' noble participants financed their own departure by mortgaging or outright selling substantial portions of their own family's ancestral land, Godfrey of Bouillon himself pledging his own family's principal fortress to the Bishop of Liège for a very considerable sum, and Robert Curthose, as we have already noted, mortgaging the entire Duchy of Normandy itself to his own younger brother, arrangements that reshaped land-holding patterns across considerable stretches of France, Germany and Italy, regardless of whether the individual Crusader in question ever actually returned home to redeem the debt. Much of this financing, in a considerable number of documented instances across France in particular, flowed through the very Jewish communities of the Rhineland and northern France, whose own members were, in that same terrible spring of 1096, being massacred by other bands of Crusaders marching toward the very same eastern destination, since Jewish moneylenders, largely excluded by church restriction from most other trades and professions, and therefore concentrated out of practical necessity rather than any particular preference, in the business of lending money at interest that canon law generally forbade Christians from practicing among themselves, represented one of the few readily available sources of the liquid capital a departing knight actually needed in hand. It is worth sitting with that bitter irony for a long moment, because it means that the same crusading movement was, in its very first months, simultaneously depending on Jewish financial capital to fund a great many of its own noble participants' departures, while other bands of crusaders, marching through those same communities on their own way to the same destination, were slaughtering Jewish families by the hundreds in the streets of Speyer and Worms and Mainz, two faces of the same movement, financial dependence and murderous violence, operating within the very same towns in the very same season, a contradiction the surviving sources record without ever pausing to note it as a contradiction at all. It was the fortuitous arrival of a fleet of Genoese and English ships at the nearby port of Jaffa in mid-June, bringing with them both fresh supplies and, crucially, skilled shipwrights and carpenters along with tools that could be used to disassemble the ship's own timbers, that finally gave the Crusaders the raw material they needed, supplemented by wood scavenged, at real risk from Muslim raiding parties, from more distant forests that Crusader foraging parties had to travel considerable distances and fight through hostile territory to reach. Over the following weeks, the Crusader army, now organised into two main besieging camps, Godfrey of Bouillon commanding the northern approach and Raymond of Toulouse the southern, constructed substantial siege towers and other equipment under the direction of skilled engineers, a slow and laborious process conducted under a blazing summer sun and constant harassment from the defenders, while the ordinary soldiers of the army suffered severely from the same lack of water that had already forced the defenders to abandon several of their own outlying positions. Several chroniclers describing Crusaders and their horses reduced to travelling considerable distances to reach the few reliable water sources still available, and paying, in several documented instances, exorbitant prices to opportunistic local merchants for water carried into camp in animal skins. It was in the midst of these final, exhausting preparations that the Crusader clergy organised a remarkable act of collective religious devotion that has become, in the centuries since, one of the most vividly remembered images of the entire campaign, a barefoot procession of the assembled Crusader army, clergy and soldiers alike, around the entire circuit of Jerusalem's walls on the 8th of July, in deliberate, conscious imitation of the biblical account of the Israelites marching around the walls of Jericho, the soldiers fasting and praying as they walked, while the city's own Muslim defenders, watching from the walls above, reportedly jeered and, in a detail several chroniclers record with real bitterness, set up crosses on the battlements to mock and desecrate before the eyes of the marching pilgrims below, an act of provocation that only hardened the Crusaders' own resolve for the assault that both sides now understood was imminent. The breach, and 2 days that the chroniclers recorded with pride rather than shame. The final assault began on the 14th of July in 1099, with the Crusaders bringing their siege towers up against the walls under a hail of stones, arrows and Greek fire from the defenders, a full day of fighting that saw the attackers repulsed from the northern wall where Godfrey's forces were engaged, while Raymond's forces to the south, positioned near the slope historians and pilgrims alike still call Mount Zion, on the ground just outside the city's southern wall, likewise failed to force a breakthrough, and it was only on the following morning, the 15th of July, that Godfrey's own siege tower, after a night of continuous fighting and repair under fire, was finally manoeuvred close enough to the wall for Crusader soldiers to bridge the gap and gain a foothold on the ramparts themselves, a breakthrough that, once achieved, spread quickly as more Crusader soldiers poured across, opening gates from within to admit the rest of the besieging army, while Raymond's forces to the south, learning of the northern breach, pressed their own attack and broke through shortly afterward as the defence, its attention and its forces suddenly divided, began to collapse entirely. What followed, once the city's defences had genuinely broken and Crusader soldiers began pouring through the streets of Jerusalem in earnest, was a massacre of a scale and a thoroughness that has defined the popular memory of this entire crusade ever more since, and it is worth telling it plainly, in the same terms the Crusaders' own chroniclers used to record it, because those chroniclers, remarkably to modern sensibilities, did not write about what followed with any hint of shame or moral discomfort at all, but rather with what reads, across 9 centuries of distance, as unmistakable religious pride. The Crusader army, having endured 3 years of hardship to reach this single moment, gave itself over to a killing that showed little distinction between combatants and civilians, Muslim men, women and children alike killed in the streets, in their own homes, and, in the massacre's single most infamous episode, inside the Temple Mount itself, where a great number of Muslims had taken refuge inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque and were slaughtered there in numbers that one Crusader chronicler, in a passage that has been quoted and requoted for 9 centuries since as the single starkest image of the entire crusade, described as leaving Crusader soldiers wading in blood up to their ankles, or in the same chronicler's own more extreme phrasing elsewhere, up to their horses' bridles, language that modern historians generally treat as deliberate scriptural exaggeration, drawing directly on the apocalyptic imagery of the Book of Revelation, rather than a literal claim about the physical depth of blood in the street, but that nonetheless communicates, with total clarity, exactly how total and how unrestrained the killing was understood to have been by the very men who took part in it, and were proud enough of the fact to record it in precisely those terms. The city's Jewish population fared no better than its Muslim residents, a number of them having gathered for shelter and mutual defence inside their own principal synagogue, which Crusader soldiers set alight with the people still trapped inside, a final grim echo of the very Rhineland massacres that had marked this whole crusading movement's earliest beginnings, back in Western Europe 3 years before, the campaign closing its central, defining act of violence in something like the same register it had opened with. Modern historians continue to debate the precise scale of the killing, with medieval chroniclers' own casualty figures running in some accounts to tens of thousands, now generally regarded as exaggerated in the manner typical of medieval battle narratives more generally. But even the most conservative modern estimates describe a death toll in the many thousands inflicted over the course of 1 or 2 days on a city whose surviving population was, in the massacre's aftermath, reduced to only a small fraction of what it had held only days before. It is worth pausing on the specific numbers this debate actually involves, because they illustrate a problem this channel has encountered before when trying to reckon honestly with the scale of historical atrocity. The Latin Christian chroniclers who were present, writing in evident and unembarrassed pride, offer figures that in some passages suggest the killing of the city's entire Muslim population, numbers that near contemporary Arabic sources, including the later chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing at some remove from the events themselves, generally corroborate in their broad horror while offering their own, sometimes differently inflated casualty estimates. Modern historians, cross-referencing these accounts against what can be reconstructed of Jerusalem's own likely total population at the time, a walled city whose entire residency, including the considerable number of refugees who had fled there from the surrounding countryside as the Crusader army approached, most plausibly numbered somewhere in the range of 20 to 40,000 people, generally conclude that the death toll, while almost certainly not the literal total annihilation the most extreme chronicle language suggests, was nonetheless immense by any standard, very likely encompassing a substantial majority of the city's Muslim inhabitants and a large portion of its Jewish community as well, a slaughter whose precise arithmetic will likely never be fixed with total certainty, but whose basic character, an overwhelming, largely indiscriminate massacre of a defeated and already surrendered population, is not seriously disputed by any serious modern historian regardless of which side's chronicle tradition they happen to be working from. Its streets, by multiple contemporary accounts, left littered with unburied corpses for days afterward, the stench so overwhelming that the Crusaders' own leadership eventually had to organise their surviving prisoners to clear the bodies simply to make the city habitable again for its new conquerors. It is worth pausing on this whole episode for a genuinely long moment, because it deserves neither the breathless, celebratory framing the original chroniclers gave it, nor a hurried, embarrassed footnote of the kind some later, more apologetic retellings have preferred. This was, by any honest modern accounting, a war crime on a massive scale, the deliberate and largely indiscriminate slaughter of a civilian population that had already surrendered in the practical military sense, the moment the city's walls were breached and its defence collapsed. And it stands as one of the 2 or 3 most infamous single episodes in the entire history of religiously motivated violence in the medieval world, remembered, to this day, across the Muslim world as a defining atrocity that shaped Muslim perceptions of Western Christendom for the better part of a millennium afterward, in a way that the Crusaders' own contemporaries, writing in the immediate flush of what they experienced as a divinely sanctioned triumph, could not have anticipated and likely would not have particularly cared about if they had. A relic recovered, and a cross that would not survive the century. It is worth pausing on one further consequence of Jerusalem's fall before we turn to the question of how the city was actually to be governed, because among the first tasks the new Christian authorities undertook, once the killing had finally stopped and the bodies had been cleared from the streets, was locating and recovering what Christian tradition held to be a fragment of the true cross itself, the actual wood on which Christ had been crucified, which local Christian residents of the city, according to several contemporary accounts, had kept carefully hidden throughout the preceding decades of Muslim rule specifically to preserve it from exactly the kind of destruction Al-Hakim had already visited on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself. This relic, once recovered and authenticated to the Crusaders' own satisfaction, became the single most venerated object in the entire Kingdom of Jerusalem for the whole of the following century, carried into battle at the head of the kingdom's own armies as a talisman of divine favour on numerous occasions in the decades that followed, its presence credited by contemporary chroniclers with inspiring Crusader forces to victories they might not otherwise have achieved. It is worth pausing on the relic's own eventual fate because it closes with a particular and rather bitter irony, a circle this whole story has already traced once before tonight. The true cross was carried into battle one final time at the calamitous engagement at Hattin in 1187, the same catastrophic defeat that opened the road to Saladin's own recapture of Jerusalem we have already discussed, and the relic itself was captured by Saladin's own victorious forces on that battlefield and never recovered by Christian hands again, its ultimate fate afterward genuinely unknown to history, an object whose recovery had once seemed, to the exhausted and triumphant conquerors of 1099, a fitting and permanent symbol of God's own blessing on their entire enterprise, lost within less than a single century to the very same forces of Muslim reunification and reconquest that would eventually undo nearly everything this crusade had accomplished. A defender who would not wear a crown, and a battle fought within days of victory. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, the Crusader leadership turned, with a speed that modern readers sometimes find jarring given the scale of the violence that had just concluded, to the entirely practical question of how the newly conquered city should actually be governed, and it was Godfrey of Bouillon, whose own reputation for piety and personal restraint had already set him somewhat apart from more overtly ambitious colleagues like Bohemond, who was selected by the assembled leadership on the 22nd of July, only a week after the massacre, to serve as the city's new ruler. Godfrey, in a gesture that later chroniclers treated as a defining statement of the whole Crusade's own self-understanding, as an act of religious devotion rather than ordinary conquest, reportedly refused to accept the title of king, declaring that he would not wear a crown of gold in the very city where Christ himself had worn a crown of thorns, accepting instead the considerably humbler title of advocate or defender of the Holy Sepulchre, a title that framed his own rule not as sovereign kingship, but as a kind of protective guardianship over the Church's own most sacred site. Godfrey's own tenure in this role proved brief, because within days of his own installation, word arrived that the Fatimid relief force Iftikhar ad-Dawla had appealed for before the city's fall was finally approaching from Egypt, a substantial army under the command of the Fatimid Vizier Alafdal Shahanshah and the Crusader leadership, understanding that a fresh field battle against a well-supplied relief army, so soon after the exhausting siege just concluded, represented a genuine existential threat to everything the campaign had achieved, marched out to meet this new threat near the coastal town of Ascalon in mid-August, only weeks after Jerusalem's own fall. The battle that followed, fought on the 12th of August in 1099, proved a decisive Crusader victory, the Fatimid army caught partially unprepared by the Crusaders' own aggressive and rapid advance, and routed with heavy losses, a victory that secured the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem against its single most immediate and most dangerous external threat, even though the Crusader leadership's own persistent internal rivalries meant that Jerusalem itself, remarkably, was not properly reinforced or resupplied to exploit this victory further, with several of the senior lords, their own vows of pilgrimage now fulfilled in their own understanding, beginning almost immediately to make preparations to return home to Western Europe, leaving the fledgling kingdom desperately undermanned at the very moment of its greatest triumph. Raymond of Toulouse, still nursing his long-standing grievances against Bohemond and increasingly marginalised within the new political order taking shape in Jerusalem itself, eventually departed the Holy Land to carve out his own separate territory further north along the Levantine coast, laying the groundwork for what would become, a few years later, the County of Tripoli, the fourth and final of the Crusader states, joining Edessa, Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself as the four distinct Latin Christian polities that the First Crusade, whatever its original stated purpose of assisting the Byzantine Empire and liberating Jerusalem for Christian pilgrimage, actually left behind as its permanent concrete territorial legacy, a patchwork of Crusader states along the eastern Mediterranean coast that would persist, in one form or another, shrinking and occasionally rallying, for very nearly 2 full centuries after this first campaign's own conclusion. Godfrey of Bouillon himself died within a year of Jerusalem's capture in July of 1100, from causes contemporary sources describe variously as illness, or in some later and considerably more colourful accounts, poisoning, and it was his brother Baldwin, the same ambitious younger son who had broken away from the main Crusader army to establish himself as ruler of Edessa, who was summoned to Jerusalem to succeed him, and who, unlike his brother, felt no particular scruples about the symbolism of a golden crown, accepting formal coronation as Baldwin I, King of Jerusalem, on Christmas Day of 1100, a title his brother had so pointedly declined only 17 months before, and establishing in the process the hereditary monarchy that would govern the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with varying degrees of stability and varying degrees of actual territorial control for the better part of the following 2 centuries. It is worth noting, too, that Baldwin's own marital history across these same years illustrates rather neatly the kind of pragmatic, dynastically minded politics that quickly came to characterise the new Crusader kingdom's own ruling class, since Baldwin had married, before ever founding Edessa, an English woman who died during the hardships of the march through Anatolia, then married an Armenian noblewoman to help cement his own new rule over Edessa's own substantial Armenian Christian population, a marriage he later set aside once he became King of Jerusalem in favour of a third match with Adelaide, the wealthy Countess of Sicily, an alliance struck largely for the sake of the considerable Sicilian financial and naval support it promised the struggling new kingdom. A sequence of unions that had rather less to do with romance than with the ordinary, unglamorous business of consolidating a fragile new state through whichever advantageous marriage happened to be available at each successive stage of his own rise to power. It is worth adding, finally, a word about the lasting physical legacy the military orders founded in this Crusade's own immediate aftermath left scattered across the landscape of the Near East, because the Templars and Hospitallers, in the decades following their own founding, became the primary builders and garrisons of an extraordinary network of fortified castles across the Crusader states, structures like the Hospitaller stronghold of Crac des Chevaliers in Syria, built up over the following century into one of the most sophisticated pieces of medieval military architecture anywhere in the world. Its concentric walls and its engineering solutions to the problem of holding a remote frontier fortress against far larger besieging armies studied by military historians, and even, according to a famous and often repeated architectural legend, by the future British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's own predecessor building enthusiasts centuries later, several of these same castles surviving today, in ruined but still recognisable form, as some of the most visited and most evocative physical remains this entire crusading era left behind anywhere in the modern Middle East, counting a cost nobody at the time thought to count carefully. It is worth pausing, before we move on to what this whole campaign actually left behind, to do something the medieval chroniclers themselves rarely bothered with, and try to reckon honestly with the human cost of the entire 3-year enterprise, because the numbers, so far as modern historians have been able to reconstruct them from the patchy and often wildly inconsistent figures the medieval sources themselves provide, are genuinely staggering. Estimates of the total number of people who set out from Western Europe across the various waves of this crusade, counting Peter the Hermit's doomed peasant army alongside the far better organised noble contingents that followed, generally range somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people, including a very considerable number of non-combatants, women, children, elderly pilgrims, and camp followers of every description who accompanied the fighting men for reasons of their own religious devotion or simple family loyalty. Of that considerable number, only a small fraction, likely somewhere between 12 and 15,000 fighting men by the time the army actually stood before the walls of Jerusalem, remained to see the campaign's final and most famous victory, the rest lost along the way to battle, disease, starvation, desertion, or simple attrition across nearly 2,000 miles and 3 full years of continuous hardship, a casualty rate that, whatever imprecision surrounds the exact figures involved, represents one of the most catastrophic losses of life inflicted on any medieval population through a single sustained military and religious campaign. It is worth pausing too on the considerably smaller and considerably less celebrated story of those who did eventually make it home, because return itself brought its own particular and often disorienting difficulties that the triumphant homecoming scenes later medieval art and literature like to imagine rarely captured with much honesty. A knight who had mortgaged his own ancestral lands to finance a 3-year absence very often returned to find those same lands still encumbered by debt, or in some documented cases already lost outright to a creditor or a rival relative who had assumed, reasonably enough after years without word, that the departed crusader was dead, and his own claims accordingly void. Wives who had managed estates and raised children alone for 3 years, in a great many cases with no reliable word of their own husband's fate for the entire duration, found the returning men who eventually did straggle home changed by an experience those who had stayed behind could barely imagine, and the church itself, for its own part, seems to have offered surprisingly little formal structure for reintegrating men who had witnessed and participated in violence and suffering on the scale this campaign had demanded, an absence that stands in some contrast to the elaborate spiritual apparatus, indulgences, absolutions and formal vows that had surrounded their own departure in the first place, as though the Church's own theological imagination had prepared thoroughly for the soul that set out on crusade, but considerably less thoroughly for the soul, however triumphant its object had genuinely been, that eventually had to find some way of living an ordinary life again afterward. It is worth sitting with that arithmetic for a moment, because it tells us something. The triumphant chronicles, understandably focused on the campaign's eventual and genuinely startling success, tend to obscure that for the great majority of the men, women and children who set out from their own homes in France, Germany, Italy and the Low Countries in response to Urban's call at Clermont, the crusade was not the story of Jerusalem's capture at all, but simply the story of their own death, from thirst on the Anatolian plateau, from a Turkish arrow outside Nicaea, from starvation inside the walls of Antioch, or from a massacre at Sivto that most of them never lived long enough to even learn, had doomed their own particular company before it ever properly began its march. The crusade that history remembers as a triumph was, for the overwhelming majority of its actual participants, a one-way journey toward an anonymous grave in a foreign land, and it is worth carrying that fact with us as we consider what this whole extraordinary undertaking actually accomplished, and for whom. A relationship with Constantinople that never really recovered. It is worth pausing too on what this whole campaign did to the relationship between the crusading movement and the Byzantine Empire, whose own request had, in the most immediate and technical sense, started the entire enterprise in the first place, because the mutual suspicion that had characterized relations between Crusaders and Byzantines from their very first uneasy negotiations outside Constantinople never meaningfully healed, and in fact worsened steadily across the decades in the subsequent crusades that followed this first one. Emperor Alexios' own daughter, the historian and Princess Anna Komnene, writing her own detailed history of her father's reign several decades after these events, gives us the fullest surviving Byzantine perspective on the entire crusade, and her own account, for all its evident learning and its genuine respect for certain individual Crusader leaders, describes the Western armies overall with a tone of real cultural condescension and real strategic alarm, portraying men she regarded as barbarians, whose own uncontrolled greed and lack of discipline consistently threatened to undo the careful, patient diplomacy her father had spent his entire reign cultivating, a perspective that reminds us, usefully, that the triumphant narrative Western chroniclers told about this campaign was never the only story being told about it, even at the time. That mutual distrust, seeded here in the earliest days of the first campaign, and deepened by Bohemon's own outright seizure of Antioch in direct violation of his sworn oath, would fester across the following century, through further crusading expeditions that repeated many of the same patterns of tension between Western Crusaders and their supposed Byzantine allies, until it finally erupted in the year 1204 into one of the single most shocking events in the entire history of the crusading movement, when the soldiers of what history calls the Fourth Crusade, diverted from their own original intended target in Egypt through a complex tangle of Venetian commercial interests and Byzantine dynastic politics that this channel may well tell in full on another night of its own, turned their own weapons not against any Muslim power at all, but against Constantinople itself, sacking the greatest Christian city in the world in an orgy of looting and destruction that historians still regard as one of the most catastrophic single blows Byzantine civilization ever suffered, a betrayal so total that it is difficult, looking back on it now, not to see its roots already present in these earliest tensions between Crusaders and Byzantines that we have traced together tonight. A partnership built from its very first days on a foundation of mutual convenience and mutual suspicion that was perhaps never going to end any other way. A kingdom of strangers, ruling a land they barely understood. It is worth pausing too on what daily life and daily governance actually looked like in the new Crusader states these conquests had produced, because the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its three sister states, Edessa, Antioch and Tripoli, faced from their very earliest years a genuinely difficult structural problem that no amount of battlefield success could resolve on its own. A comparatively tiny population of Western European settlers, nobility, knights, and the ordinary craftsmen, farmers and merchants who followed in their wake seeking a new and better life on conquered soil, attempting to govern a considerably larger and considerably more established population of native inhabitants, Muslim, Eastern Christian of several distinct denominations, and Jewish, whose own customs, languages and legal traditions the new Latin rulers understood only imperfectly at best. The resulting system of governance, codified over the following decades in a body of law known as the Assizes of Jerusalem, established a rigidly stratified feudal society in which the Frankish settlers, as the Western newcomers came to be called by the native populations they now ruled over, occupied the top tier of a hierarchy that generally left existing local populations to continue much of their own, ordinary agricultural and commercial life largely undisturbed, so long as they paid the taxes and rents now owed to their new Frankish lords, a pragmatic arrangement of conquest that, whatever its origins in the extraordinary violence of the campaign we have spent tonight describing, settled over the following years into something closer to ordinary, if unequal, coexistence than continuous religious warfare, with intermarriage, trade, and even a considerable degree of cultural exchange developing between the Frankish settlers and their Eastern Christian, Muslim and Jewish neighbours in the decades that followed the initial conquest, producing by the time of the second generation of Crusader settlers a hybrid Levantine Frankish culture that visiting European pilgrims sometimes found startlingly, even scandalously, adapted to local customs of food, dress, and daily life. It is worth pausing too on a group whose own experience of this new order this story has not yet fully addressed: the native Eastern Christian populations of the region, Greek Orthodox, Armenian and Syriac Christians, whose own churches had worshipped in this same land for many centuries before the Crusaders' own arrival, and whose relationship with their new Latin Christian rulers proved, in practice, considerably more complicated than a simple, shared Christian faith might suggest. The Crusader conquerors, holding to the specifically Latin, Rome-obedient form of Christianity that had formally split from the Greek Orthodox Church only some 4 decades earlier, in the Great Schism of 1054, generally regarded these older Eastern Christian traditions with real theological suspicion, and moved quickly upon establishing their own new kingdom, to replace the existing Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem with a Latin churchman of their own choosing, subordinating the ancient Eastern churches of the conquered territory to a new Latin ecclesiastical hierarchy, in a manner that a great many of the native Christian population experienced as its own kind of religious displacement, however much gentler in practice than the wholesale massacre visited on the city's Muslim and Jewish residents. Some Eastern Christian communities, the Maronites of Lebanon prominent among them, found genuine common cause and lasting alliance with the new Latin rulers, while others, particularly the Greek Orthodox population, that had, after all, been the very Christians whose distress had originally prompted Alexios's own appeal to Urban in the first place, found themselves treated by their own supposed liberators as a faith community, to be managed and subordinated rather than as full partners in a shared Christian triumph. One more example of how thoroughly this whole campaign's own tangled motives, genuine religious solidarity, ecclesiastical rivalry, and plain territorial ambition, refused to sort themselves cleanly into the simple narrative of Christian liberation the Crusaders' own chroniclers preferred to tell. It was in the years immediately following the First Crusade's conclusion that 2 of the most historically consequential institutions to emerge from this whole campaign were founded: the military religious orders that would come to define Crusader warfare and Crusader finance for the following 2 centuries. The Knights Templar were founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugh of Paynes and a small band of companions, originally dedicating themselves to the specific and practical task of protecting Christian pilgrims travelling the dangerous roads between the coast and Jerusalem itself, and receiving quarters, according to tradition, on the Temple Mount itself, on the site believed to be the ruins of the ancient Jewish temple, a location that gave the order its own enduring name. The Knights Hospitaller, whose own origins as a charitable order caring for sick pilgrims, actually predated the Crusade itself, having operated a hospital in Jerusalem even under Muslim rule in the decades before the Crusader conquest, transformed in these same years into a parallel military order, and both organisations would go on to become, within a generation, formidably wealthy, formidably well-organised international institutions with their own networks of fortified castles across the Crusader states and their own extensive financial and landholding operations back in Western Europe, pioneering, in the process, financial and organisational techniques, including early forms of what we might recognise as international banking and letters of credit for travelling pilgrims that would influence European commercial practice for centuries after the Crusader states themselves had ceased to exist. It is worth pausing too on the considerable role Italian maritime power played in making the Crusader state's own long-term survival possible at all. A role this story has already touched on in passing, but that deserves a fuller word here, because the great trading republics of Genoa, Pisa and Venice provided the naval support. The fleets of ships capable of ferrying reinforcements, supplies and pilgrims across the Mediterranean, and of blockading Muslim-held ports along the coast, that a fledgling kingdom without any navy of its own could never have assembled independently, and these Italian city-states extracted, in exchange for that support, extremely favourable trading privileges in the Crusader state's own port cities, entire self-governing merchant quarters with their own churches, warehouses and legal exemptions carved out of cities like Acre, Tyre and Antioch, arrangements that transformed the Crusader states, alongside their obvious religious and military significance, into a genuinely important new node in the Mediterranean's own long-distance trading network, funneling spices, silk, and other luxury goods from the wider Islamic world and beyond into European markets through Italian shipping in a commercial relationship that would go on to enrich Genoa and Venice considerably more, in purely financial terms, than it ever enriched the Crusader kingdom whose own conquests had made the arrangement possible in the first place, a conquest that woke a sleeping rival. It is worth pausing finally on how the Muslim world itself understood, and eventually responded to this whole sudden violent intrusion, because the Crusaders' own initial success owed a great deal, as we have already noted, to the simple fact that the Muslim Near East in the final years of the 11th century was itself deeply divided. The rival Sunni Seljuk and Shia Fatimid powers, locked in their own long-standing struggle for religious and political supremacy, that left neither side willing or able to mount a fully unified response to this new Christian invasion, a fragmentation the Crusaders exploited, whether through calculated strategy or simple good fortune, at nearly every stage of their own advance. That fragmentation, however, would not last indefinitely, because the shock and the humiliation of Jerusalem's fall and the massacre that accompanied it gradually began to generate over the following decades a genuine and increasingly unified concept of counter-crusade within the Muslim world, a religious and political rallying cry built around the specific goal of recovering Jerusalem, Islam's own third holiest city, from Frankish occupation. That process of unification began in earnest, with a Turkish atabeg named Zengi, who captured the Crusader county of Edessa itself in 1144, the very first of the Crusader states to fall, and an event whose shock back in Western Europe prompted the launching of an entire second crusading expedition, a campaign this channel may well tell in full on another night, that ended, unlike the first, in comprehensive and humiliating failure for the Christian forces involved. Zengi's own son, Nur ad-Din, continued this project of Muslim unification against the Crusader states with real success, and it was Nur ad-Din's own eventual successor, a Kurdish general who had become the single most famous Muslim leader of the entire crusading era, a man named Salah ad-Din, known to Western history as Saladin, who finally completed this long process of consolidation, uniting Egypt and Syria under his own rule, and inflicting, in 1187, a catastrophic defeat on the combined forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at a battle called Hattin, a defeat so total that it opened the road to Jerusalem itself, which Saladin recaptured later that same year, 88 years after the massacre that had first delivered the city into Frankish hands, a recapture that this same Saladin, in a detail Western and Muslim chroniclers alike, took considerable and pointed note of at the time, conducted with a clemency and a restraint toward the city's Christian population that stood in stark and deliberate contrast to the wholesale slaughter the First Crusade's own soldiers had visited on Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants 9 decades before, a contrast this channel may well have occasion to explore at much greater length on some future night of its own. Where this whole story actually comes from. It is worth pausing, before we consider what all of this actually meant and how later ages have chosen to remember it, to say a word about the sources this whole account has been drawn from. because unlike some of the more purely legendary stories we have told in this room, the First Crusade sits close enough to the beginning of Europe's own systematic historical record that we possess a genuinely rich and genuinely varied body of contemporary and near-contemporary testimony, written from strikingly different perspectives that rarely agree with each other on the finer points of exactly what happened or why. The single most important Latin source is a text known as the Gesta Francorum, the Deeds of the Franks, an anonymous account written on the strength of internal evidence by a knight who appears to have served directly under Bohemond and who travelled with the army through nearly every stage of the campaign we have described tonight. A vivid, often startlingly frank first-hand narrative that later and more polished chroniclers, writing back in Europe without ever having made the journey themselves, borrowed from extensively, sometimes acknowledging their source and sometimes simply incorporating its material wholesale into their own more literary retellings. Alongside it stands the chronicle of Fulcher of Chartres, a priest who accompanied Baldwin of Boulogne to Edessa and later settled permanently in the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, giving us an account written by a man who lived among the Crusader states for decades after the initial conquest, and who continued updating his own history well into the 12th century, and the chronicle of Raymond of Aguilera, a chaplain who served directly under Raymond of Toulouse, and who gives us, understandably, one of our fullest and most sympathetic accounts of the discovery of the Holy Lance at Antioch, an episode his own patron had staked considerable personal credibility on. Beyond these Latin Christian sources, we possess Anna Komnena's own Byzantine perspective in her history known as the Alexiad, written decades later by a genuinely learned princess with access to her father's own court records and her own vivid personal memories of the Crusader armies passing through Constantinople in her own childhood, a source whose cultural condescension toward the Western armies we have already noted, but that provides an invaluable corrective to the purely Latin Christian framing of nearly every other surviving source. And we possess, too, a body of contemporary Muslim chronicles, most notably the work of the Damascus chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi, writing from within the Muslim world he described, and giving us an account of the Crusades' arrival and its early conquests that reads, understandably, as a story of catastrophe and invasion rather than of triumphant pilgrimage, a perspective largely invisible to Western audiences, until modern historians began systematically translating and incorporating these Arabic sources into the wider historical record only in the past century or so, a reminder worth sitting with of how long the West told this particular story almost entirely to itself, using almost entirely its own sources, before finally beginning, in relatively recent decades, to actually listen to how the people on the receiving end of this whole invasion had described it themselves, faith, land, and the argument historians still have not settled. It is worth pausing, too, on a question this channel has learned to ask of nearly every great historical movement it has told a story about, which is simply this: why did people actually do this? What, in the end, actually drove tens of thousands of ordinary men and women to abandon their homes and risk near certain hardship, and for a great many of them, near certain death, on the strength of one sermon delivered in a French field? And it is worth being honest that historians have argued about the true balance of motivations behind this crusade for well over a century now, without ever reaching anything like full consensus, and this channel does not intend to pretend the argument is settled tonight. An older generation of historians, writing particularly across the 19th and earlier 20th centuries, tended to emphasise material and economic motivations rather heavily, painting the crusade as, at bottom, a land grab by Europe's own surplus population of landless younger sons, operating under systems of inheritance that left them with little prospect of advancement at home, dressed up in religious language that provided convenient moral cover for what was, underneath it, an essentially opportunistic venture. More recent scholarship, drawing on increasingly sophisticated analysis, of the actual wills, charters and financial records left behind by departing Crusaders, has pushed back hard against this purely materialist reading, noting that a great many of the Crusades' most prominent noble participants were, in fact, already wealthy, established landholders who mortgaged or sold off considerable portions of their own existing property, specifically to finance an expedition that offered them, in purely economic terms, an extremely poor investment, a pattern of behaviour that makes far more sense if we take these men's own professed religious motivations, the desire to earn the indulgence Urban had promised and to perform, in the most literal and physically demanding way imaginable, an act of penance for their own sins, considerably more seriously and considerably more literally than earlier, more cynical historical interpretations were generally willing to do. The historian Jonathan Riley Smith, whose own detailed archival work on surviving Crusader charters and family land records did more than perhaps any other single scholars to shift the weight of modern academic opinion in this particular direction, argued influentially that the Crusade is best understood not as disguised land hunger at all, but as a genuine and remarkably costly act of devotional love, an argument that has itself, in turn, been pushed back against by other historians who note that even sincere religious conviction and hard practical calculation were never, for a medieval nobleman, quite as separable as a modern reader might wish them to be, since believing sincerely that God had commanded this specific war, and believing that a successful war of conquest might also incidentally provide land and opportunity for a landless younger son, were entirely compatible beliefs for a man living inside 11th century Christendom's own thoroughly integrated understanding of providence, ambition, and divine will operating together rather than in separate competing compartments. The honest answer, so far as this channel can offer one, is almost certainly that both of these explanations were true at once. In different proportions for different individuals, a knight from Toulouse might have been moved by a genuine and overwhelming religious conviction that Urban's offer represented his own soul's best chance at salvation, while a younger son with no land to inherit found in that same religious call a socially and spiritually sanctioned outlet for an ambition that had no other legitimate avenue for expression at home, and a peasant following Peter. The hermit might have been driven by some combination of genuine apocalyptic religious fervour and simple, desperate economic hardship that made the promise of a new life, however uncertain, considerably more appealing than the certain poverty waiting for them at home. Human motivation, this whole story reminds us, as so many of the stories we have told in this room have reminded us before, rarely sorts itself neatly into a single explanatory box, and an event this large, drawing on the individual decisions of tens of thousands of separate people, was never going to be reducible to any single tidy cause, a word later ages made to mean something the participants themselves never quite intended. It is worth noting, finally, a curious linguistic fact about this whole campaign that surprises many people encountering this story for the first time, which is that the word crusade itself, so central to how we now describe and remember this entire 2-century phenomenon, was not actually the term the participants of this first expedition used to describe what they were doing at all. The Latin sources generally describe the enterprise as an iter, a journey or an expedition, or as a peregrinatio, a pilgrimage, framing the whole undertaking in the participants' own contemporary language as an armed extension of the already well-established Christian tradition of pilgrimage to holy sites, rather than as a wholly new category of religious warfare requiring its own new vocabulary. The word crusade itself, derived from the Latin word for cross, in reference to the cloth crosses participants sewed onto their own clothing as a mark of their vow, only entered common usage considerably later, well after this first expedition had already passed into history, and subsequent campaigns had made the whole phenomenon of armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land into a recognised and recurring category of its own. It is worth pausing too on how differently later centuries have chosen to remember and to deploy this whole story, because the Crusades' own reputation has swung across the centuries since, between wildly different poles depending on what each subsequent age needed the story to mean. Enlightenment historians of the 18th century, deeply suspicious of what they regarded as irrational religious fanaticism, generally treated the Crusades as a shameful monument to medieval superstition and violence. The Romantic era of the 19th century, by sharp contrast, rehabilitated the Crusaders considerably, recasting them as chivalrous, adventurous heroes in a wave of popular novels, paintings, and even the naming of European colonial ventures in the Middle East, a rehabilitation that fed directly into the imperial ambitions several European powers pursued in the very same region during that same century, explicitly invoking Crusader imagery and Crusader precedent to justify their own colonial projects. And the word itself remains, to this day, a genuinely live and genuinely contested piece of language, invoked periodically by modern political and religious figures on more than one side of ongoing conflicts in the very same region this whole story unfolded across. A fact this channel notes not to wade into any contemporary political argument, which is not our purpose here, but simply to observe how remarkably long a shadow 3-year campaign, undertaken by a comparatively small number of medieval Europeans 9 centuries ago, has managed to cast across the language and the politics of the entire world that came after it. It is worth pausing, too, on how quickly this whole campaign became not merely history, but literature in its own right, because medieval French poets, within only a few decades of Jerusalem's own capture, had already begun weaving the Crusades' own real events, heavily embellished and increasingly fantastical with each retelling, into an entire cycle of epic poems historians now call the chansons de geste, songs of heroic deeds, a genre that had already produced only shortly before the Crusade itself this single, most famous secular epic poem of the entire medieval period, the Song of Roland, and that now turned its own considerable narrative energy toward mythologizing Godfrey of Bouillon and his companions in exactly the same heroic register, producing entire invented adventures and entirely fictional early lives for men whose own real biographies, dramatic enough on their own terms as we've spent tonight discovering, were apparently not considered quite legendary enough on their own for the poets and the audiences of the following century. It is worth noting, too, one specific legend this cycle of poetry helps cement permanently into popular memory: the Tafurs, a band of desperately poor crusaders, without armour, without proper weapons, and by several contemporary accounts driven by a fervour even more extreme and even more violent than that of the knights they marched alongside, whom later legend and more than one contemporary chronicler associated directly with the horror at Ma'ara, their own poverty and their own religious fanaticism combining, in the popular imagination this whole story left behind, into a figure of genuine dread even among their own supposed comrades, a detail modern historians treat with considerable caution, given how readily medieval chroniclers reached for a convenient scapegoat class to bear the blame for an atrocity the whole army had in fact participated in together, what it actually felt like to be one of them. It is worth pausing before we follow a few of this story's individual participants to the end of their own separate lives, to reconstruct, so far as the surviving sources allow us to, what the ordinary daily texture of this whole extraordinary journey actually felt like for the people living through it, because the grand sweep of sieges and battles we've spent tonight tracing can make it easy to forget that this was, for every single person who undertook it, also a matter of extremely ordinary and extremely exhausting physical experience stretched out across 3 years of a person's own single finite life. The army that marched, at its largest, was not a purely military body at all, but something closer to a moving city. Soldiers and knights certainly, but trailed by an enormous entourage of non-combatants, wives and children who had chosen, or in many cases had no real choice but to accompany their own husbands and fathers rather than remain behind alone, priests and chaplains tending to the army's constant and considerable spiritual needs, blacksmiths and farriers keeping horses shod and weapons repaired, and a great crowd of poorer pilgrims with no military role at all, drawn along simply by their own religious devotion and their own hope of reaching Jerusalem alive, a whole moving society that had to be fed, watered, and sheltered as best it could manage across terrain that, particularly in Anatolia's arid interior, provided precious little of any of those three things in the quantities such an enormous host actually required. Disease, more than any battle we have described tonight, was the campaign's true and most relentless killer, moving through the crowded, unsanitary conditions of camp life with a speed and a lethality that period medicine had almost no effective tools to combat, dysentery and typhoid spreading rapidly through populations drinking from contaminated water sources, and what the chroniclers simply call plague or pestilence, carrying off soldiers and nobles alike with no apparent regard for rank, claiming, as we have already noted, the life of Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy himself at the very height of the Antioch campaign, a loss that removed, at a critical moment, the one figure whose spiritual authority had done more than any other single person to hold the fractious noble leadership together. Contemporary medical understanding, still working almost entirely from classical theories of bodily humours inherited from ancient Greek medicine, offered the sick and dying of this army little beyond prayer, whatever herbal remedies camp physicians could gather, and the simple, grim hope that a particular fever would break before it killed. And it is worth remembering, too, that this whole ordeal was recorded in real time by people writing letters home to families who had no way of knowing, for months or sometimes years at a stretch, whether their own husbands, sons or brothers were even still alive. Stephen of Blois' own surviving letters to his wife Adela, written from the Crusader camp outside Antioch during the siege's darkest and most desperate months, give us an unusually intimate window into this experience. A nobleman writing home with real and evident affection, describing the campaign's progress with considerable pride in its early successes and considerable anxiety as conditions worsened. Letters that survive today as one of our very best sources precisely because they were never intended as a public record or a heroic chronicle at all, but simply as one worried husband's attempt to reassure a wife and family waiting anxiously month after month for news that might never come, a count who fled and the wife who sent him back to die. It is worth following Stephen of Blois' own personal story a little further than we have so far tonight, because it did not end with his own quiet departure from the Siege of Antioch in its darkest hour, and the manner of its actual ending tells us something worth knowing about how the Crusades' failures were judged and answered even after the main campaign itself had concluded. Stephen returned home to France in the immediate aftermath of his own flight from Antioch, and found himself, upon his arrival, an object of real and pointed shame, most sharply from his own wife Adela, the daughter of William the Conqueror, and a woman of formidable will in her own right, who is said, by more than one later account, to have reproached her husband so relentlessly for abandoning his own sacred vow that he eventually felt compelled to redeem his own reputation by joining a follow-up expedition, sometimes called the Crusade of 1101, organised in the wake of the First Crusade's own stunning and widely publicised success to reinforce the newly established Crusader states. That second expedition ended in considerably less glory than the first, ambushed and largely destroyed by Turkish forces in Anatolia, and Stephen of Blois himself, having survived that disaster, continued on regardless to the Holy Land, where he took part the following year in a battle near the town of Ramla against a renewed Fatimid Egyptian offensive, a battle in which the heavily outnumbered Crusader force was overwhelmed, and Stephen of Blois, the very man whose earlier flight from Antioch had so haunted his own reputation, died on the field rather than flee a second time, a death several chroniclers record with a specific and pointed satisfaction, treating it as a kind of moral redemption that closed out in blood the shame his own earlier desertion had opened, the fates of the men who led it. It is worth closing out the personal story of this crusade's other principal leaders as well, because their own subsequent lives scattered across the decade or so following Jerusalem's fall tell us a good deal about what this whole campaign actually meant for the individual ambitions that had driven so much of its own internal politics from the very beginning. Bohemond of Taranto, having secured Antioch for himself against the objections of Raymond of Toulouse, and in direct violation of his own sworn oath to Alexios, was captured by a rival Turkish emir only a couple of years after the Crusade's conclusion, and held for ransom for several years before being freed, after which he returned briefly to Europe to raise support and troops for an ambitious and, as it turned out, badly miscalculated invasion of Byzantine territory in the Balkans, essentially resuming the very war his own father had once waged against Alexios decades before. A campaign that ended in humiliating defeat and forced Bohemond to accept a peace treaty formally subordinating himself to the very emperor whose own oath he had broken at Antioch, a fittingly ironic close to the career of the Crusade's single most consistently self-interested leader. And he died not long afterward in southern Italy, his own principality of Antioch passing to his young son under the regency of his loyal nephew Tancred, who continued to govern and expand the principality with real skill until his own death from illness in 1112. Raymond of Toulouse, the Crusade's most consistently pious senior leader, and the man who had argued longest and most stubbornly for honouring the Crusaders' own oaths to Byzantium, spent his own final years pursuing the establishment of the county of Tripoli, laying siege to the city that would eventually give the county its name for years before finally dying in 1105 without ever having lived to see that city's actual capture, which fell only a few years after his own death, thanks to the persistence of his own successors, a slow, grinding, less glorious conclusion befitting a man whose own crusading career, for all his genuine piety, had been marked more by frustration and marginalisation at the hands of his fellow lords than by the kind of dramatic personal triumph enjoyed by men like Bohemond or Godfrey. It fell instead to Raymond's own successors, and finally to his son Bertrand, arriving from Toulouse with fresh reinforcements and the naval support of a Genoese fleet, to finally complete the city's capture in 1109, some 4 years after the Count, who had spent so much of his own life besieging it, had already died. Still watching its walls from a distance, the fourth and final Crusader state established at last, on ground its own original claimant never lived to actually rule, women on a road built for soldiers. It is worth pausing too, before we bring this whole long account to its close, on a group of participants this story has necessarily mentioned only in passing so far, because women accompanied this crusade in numbers. The chronicles, written overwhelmingly by clergy focused on recording the deeds of the army's male commanders, rarely paused to count carefully, ranging from the noble women who travelled alongside their own husbands, several of whom appear by name in the surviving sources, to the far larger number of ordinary wives, mothers, and daughters who walked the entire length of this brutal journey, as camp followers, cooking, tending the sick and wounded, and in some documented instances, according to both Christian and Muslim sources describing the fighting at Antioch, carrying water and stones to the walls during active combat, or in the most extreme accounts, taking up arms themselves in the desperate final defence of a besieged camp. The Church's own moral anxieties about a mixed army of men and women, travelling together for years at a stretch, produced, at several points during the campaign, formal calls from the clergy for stricter separation and greater sexual discipline among the ranks, particularly during the darkest and most desperate stretches of the Siege of Antioch, when several chroniclers explicitly connected the army's own military setbacks to what they characterised as God's displeasure at the moral laxity of a camp that had, in their own telling, allowed such close and prolonged proximity between unmarried men and women to go too long unaddressed. A theological anxiety that tells us, at the very least, that women's presence on this campaign was significant enough to worry the clergy accompanying it a great deal. A pope who never learned that his own prayer had been answered. It is worth pausing on one final, quietly devastating detail before we consider what this whole campaign ultimately left behind, because it concerns the one man whose own single sermon in a French field had set this entire 3-year catastrophe and triumph into motion in the first place. Pope Urban II, who had launched this expedition at Clermont in November of 1095, and who had spent the following years anxiously awaiting whatever news might eventually reach him across the enormous distance separating Rome from the Holy Land, died on the 29th of July in 1099 in Rome, only 2 weeks after Jerusalem itself had fallen to the army he had called into being, and before any news of that fall travelling by ship and by messenger across the whole breadth of the Mediterranean had any realistic chance of having reached him. It is worth sitting with that single fact for a long moment, because it means that the man most directly responsible for setting this entire chain of events in motion, the sermon, the massacres in the Rhineland, the annihilation of Peter the Hermit's peasant army, the desperate sieges of Nicaea and Antioch, and the final terrible slaughter inside Jerusalem's own walls, died without ever knowing whether any of it had actually succeeded, whether the enormous cost in human life his own preaching had helped set in motion had purchased anything at all, or whether it had simply consumed tens of thousands of lives for nothing. He spent his final years, so far as the surviving record allows us to reconstruct his own state of mind, in genuine uncertainty about the fate of an undertaking that would, within a few short years of his own death, come to define his entire papacy and his entire historical legacy more thoroughly than anything else he ever did or said. A man who reshaped the medieval world's entire understanding of holy war and religious violence, and who left this life never once learning whether his own prayers and the tens of thousands of lives spent answering them had actually been heard. A kingdom that lasted 2 centuries and finally did not. It is worth closing out briefly the longer story of what these Crusader conquests actually became, because the states this campaign left behind did not vanish the moment their founders died, but persisted, shrinking and occasionally rallying for very nearly 200 years after the events we have spent tonight describing. The county of Edessa, the very first Crusader state Baldwin had carved out for himself, was also the first to fall, captured by Zengi in 1144, as we've already noted, an event that triggered the disastrous Second Crusade. The Principality of Antioch and the county of Tripoli endured considerably longer, weathering the rise of Saladin and outliving the kingdom of Jerusalem's own catastrophic defeat at Hattin, though both were eventually reduced to a handful of coastal fortresses. And the kingdom of Jerusalem itself, though it lost the city that gave it its own name in 1187, persisted for another full century afterwards as a much diminished coastal state, its capital relocated to the port city of Acre, sustained by repeated further crusading expeditions from Europe, including the massive but ultimately indecisive Third Crusade led by figures including England's own King Richard the Lionheart, till the very last significant Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre itself, finally fell to Mamluk Egyptian forces in 1291, bringing to a definitive close very nearly 2 full centuries of continuous Frankish presence in the Holy Land that had begun with the single campaign we have spent this entire night describing, what one sermon actually purchased. We are nearly at the end of tonight's long story, and it is worth asking plainly the same question this channel has learned to ask at the close of every great catastrophe and every great triumph it has told you about in this room. What did it actually cost, and what did it actually buy? The First Crusade cost, by the most careful reckoning modern historians can offer, the lives of the great majority of the 60 to 100,000 people who set out from Western Europe in response to Urban's call, killed by battle, by starvation, by disease, and by simple exhaustion across a journey of nearly 2,000 miles and 3 full years. It cost the lives of an unknown but considerable number of Rhineland Jews, killed by crusading mobs before the campaign had even properly begun. It cost the lives of many thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem itself, slaughtered in the 2 days following the city's fall in a massacre its own perpetrators recorded with pride rather than shame. And it cost, in the decades and centuries that followed, an entire cycle of retaliatory violence, further crusades, further massacres, and further wars that would not fully play itself out until the last Crusader fortress fell, nearly 200 years later, and whose bitter historical memory, on both sides of that long conflict, persists in some form even into our own present day. What it purchased, in the most narrow and immediate sense, was a Christian kingdom in Jerusalem that lasted, in one reduced form or another, for very nearly 2 centuries, a network of Crusader states that reshaped trade and cultural exchange across the Eastern Mediterranean for that same span of time, and a set of religious and military institutions, the Templars and the Hospitallers chief among them, whose own financial and organisational innovations would influence European society for generations after the Crusader states themselves had disappeared entirely. Whether any of that genuinely justified the scale of the cost, this channel is not going to pretend to answer for you, because it is not the kind of question this whole story ever actually resolves, any more than the wars and empires and disasters we have described on other nights in this room ever resolve their own equivalent arithmetic of cost against benefit into some tidy, comfortable balance. What this story does offer, plainly and without much room for doubt, is a demonstration of exactly how far an idea, once it is given the right combination of religious authority, political convenience, and genuine human desperation and desire, can actually travel, carrying tens of thousands of ordinary people with it across an entire continent and back, and leaving behind, when it was finally over, a changed world that none of the people who first heard Urban's sermon in that French field could possibly have imagined they were building toward. It is worth pausing one final time on how this story rhymes with others we have spent long nights on together in this very room, because the echoes are worth naming plainly rather than leaving unspoken. We have already told you, on another night, of a different siege, outside a different city, that also stretched on for years longer than anyone besieging it had expected, and that also ended when the walls finally gave way in a slaughter its own victors recorded with pride rather than shame, a pattern of triumph curdling immediately into massacre that this story has now shown you was not a single, isolated horror of the Bronze Age at all, but something civilizations have found their own way back to again and again across thousands of years of recorded history. We have told you too of a man who fled one burning world only to spend the whole rest of his life building another one on foreign soil, at a cost that fell most heavily not on himself but on the people who trusted him along the way. And you will have heard, tonight, exactly that same shape, repeating itself in the founding of the Crusader states, a scattering of new Frankish lordships raised out of conquered ground by men who told themselves, with real and evident sincerity, that a higher duty justified whatever the conquest actually cost the people who already lived there. And it is worth naming too what makes this particular story different from all of those, because the difference matters. Achilles chased a glory he chose for himself. Aeneas carried a duty, a prophecy laid on him without his consent. Odysseus endured a wandering he never wanted, for the sake of a home that was at least unquestionably his own to return to. The men and women who marched to Jerusalem carried something else again, an idea that was never really any single one of theirs to begin with, handed to them whole by a pope standing in a field, refined by preachers and bishops into a promise that their own accumulated fear of death and their own accumulated guilt over lives spent in violence could be answered once and for all by marching to the far side of the known world and taking a city that had never, in any personal sense, belonged to a single one of them. It is, in that sense, the same law of disasters this channel has traced across other long nights in this room, that catastrophe is rarely chosen outright by any single villain, but is instead assembled, piece by ordinary piece, out of reasonable decisions made by reasonable people, A pope solving two separate problems with one convenient sermon, a count settling an old grudge, a starving army seizing gratefully on a lucky discovery pulled from the dirt beneath a cathedral floor, until the accumulated weight of all those separate, individually explicable choices produces something that no single person looking back on it honestly afterward would ever have chosen to build on purpose. That is what makes an idea like this one so much more dangerous in the end than any individual hero's own private ambition or private grief. Because a private ambition eventually exhausts itself in one life, one grave, one quiet ending on a mountainside or a funeral pyre, while an idea capable of moving 100,000 people at once it is loose in the world, answers to no single person's own conscience at all, and can carry on consuming lives long after the man who first spoke it aloud has been in his own grave for decades, which is very nearly, this whole story has shown you tonight, exactly what it did. It is worth closing, before we let this whole long story finally rest, on the single image this channel keeps returning to across every account of catastrophe and conquest it has ever told you in this room, because it applies here with a particular and unusually literal force. Every one of the men and women whose journey we have followed tonight, the peasant who followed Peter the Hermit's donkey out of simple, desperate hope, the knight who mortgaged his own family's land for a war he genuinely believed would save his soul, the starving soldier digging through the floor of a cathedral for a relic he needed, more than he had ever needed anything. To actually be real was living, in the moment of their own decision, an entirely ordinary life making an entirely explicable choice. And it was only the accumulated weight of tens of thousands of those same, ordinary, explicable choices, stacked one on top of another across 3 years and 2,000 miles, that produced something none of them, standing alone in a French field on a November afternoon in 1095, could possibly have foreseen themselves building. That is perhaps the truest and the most uncomfortable lesson this whole long night has to offer, that history's largest catastrophes are very rarely the work of any single villain making any single monstrous choice, but are instead assembled, slowly and almost invisibly, out of a great many smaller, more forgivable ones, made by people who believed, every single one of them, that they were doing something good. There is no more road left to march tonight, and no more wall left to breach. The armies have long since gone home, or they have never gone home at all. And either way, the long silence of the desert and the mountain pass has finally settled back over the road they once walked. The fires long since burned down to ash. The dust long since settled back over the ground where so very many of them, on both sides of every wall, once fell. If you are still awake listening to all of this, you do not have to be. Whatever particular weight you yourself carried into this quiet room tonight, whatever worry followed you here from your own long day, let it settle a little now, gently, the way every long story we tell together in this quiet room eventually asks it to. If tonight's long story carried you somewhere worth going, you are welcome to like the video and subscribe, and if you would like to, leave a thought down in the comments and I will read it in the morning, but that is tomorrow's business, and it can wait until the sun comes up properly on its own. For now, let your body settle a little more heavily into the bed beneath you. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench whatever you have been holding on to all day without even noticing, and let whatever you carried into this room tonight settle down quietly alongside them. Let your breathing slow, all on its own, the way it always wants to when a long story finally reaches its own quiet end, and let the sound of marching feet and distant siege engines and creaking wooden towers fade out gently behind you, the way they finally faded after 3 long years for the small and exhausted handful of pilgrims who actually lived long enough to see, with their own eyes, The walls they had crossed an entire continent and buried so many of the people they loved along the way to finally reach. Close your eyes and let yourself rest now too, however far away your own quiet room actually is from any of the roads we have walked together tonight. Whatever road brought you to this room tonight, whatever long day or long year you are yourself still marching through, rest well now and let tomorrow, whenever it finally arrives, take care of whatever walls still stand in front of you. Good night and truly sweet dreams to you, wherever you are.